Yeah.
Hi, hello, everyone. We were just admiring the sound of John's typewriter. We are excited to have a situation here where John is a co-author on the paper that David Barak is going to present. And John has acknowledged that because of this, he will blame anything that's wrong on him, and he won't necessarily act his critical self. So let's see how it goes. I'm excited about this one. I saw that a lot of people are mentioning where they are from, and that's very exciting. We were all very excited about this. And for those of you who have joined us for the first time, the Learning Salon is an interdisciplinary forum where we have people from neuroscience, psychology, computer science, machine learning, philosophy, various other fields discuss intersections between biological and artificial learning. We try to discuss things together. So talks are usually short. The presenter talks for about 10 to 15 minutes, but the discussions go on for 2 to 3 hours. We have all of us on screen have a lot of interdisciplinary interests. John reads probably more books than most of the people that I know, and is now out of the picture, but he's actually here. So, there you go. And you can see some of his books there you go. That's his bookshelf. And we have some philosophers in the audience, some neuroscientists and computer scientists who are regulars. So we will bring some on screen to discuss. If you ask your questions to the speaker in the Ask a Question area, and mention whether you'd be okay with joining stage, and the only way to indicate that you're not just say, ask for me. Otherwise, if you get very highly voted, we might ask you on stage if the flow of the conversation goes there. And if you have any clarification questions, please ask it in the chat area that is right there, and some of the behind the scenes members of the Salon could answer you. One thing that's very important is that if you are a junior person, or if this is a different field you're not familiar with, there are no dumb questions, whether it's a clarification question or it's a question to the speaker, add it in the chat or add it in the Ask a Question area, and someone will either address it, or if we don't get to it, you can sort of bring it up also in the chat, or maybe email the speaker or something in case your question isn't addressed. One last thing, as always, we don't tolerate hate speech. So if there is any kind of, disrespect is not tolerated, but disagreement is very much, if it's a justified disagreement, we welcome it, because the whole idea is long format discussions. But disrespect and hate speech is not tolerated, and people who engage in hate speech will get ejected from the salon. With the rules in mind, I hand it off to John to introduce David, because he seems to be the person with the most information about him.
Oh, God, I wasn't even thinking of doing this.
No,
No. I'm happy to.
We all know David so well.
Yes. So, and also because I think Ida very much set up the tradition of not having to go through a litany of people's backgrounds and educations and things like that. But I think, David is obviously someone very dear to my heart. I think I met David about 3 years ago. I was aware that he was had a PhD in philosophy, even though it was at that time a postdoc at the Zuckerman at Columbia. And I was and am working on this book, and I very much wanted to shamelessly pick his brain. And so I remember we went for a coffee, I think, near the Zuckerman, and we got talking. And it was a little bit like being a little sailboat going into gale force winds. It was, wow, who is this person? And we got talking, and I think at some point I was asked by the Nature Reviews Neuroscience to write some sort of article, and I wasn't sure what to think of doing. And then somehow we got into a conversation, and we thought we would do something that came out of our conversations. And so, because David is really that double threat, he's a talented, thoughtful primate neurophysiologist, neuroscientist, and also a philosopher, and really has been able to fuse those two in a very interesting way, and has written some really lovely papers, actually, in the philosophy literature, which I very much recommend. And that's it, really. He is exactly the kind of interface that he personifies what we believe in here at the Salon, and I hope you enjoy his talk. I'm biased, obviously. Welcome, David.
We can see that you're biased.
Thank you.
That was a joke.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ida and Josh and John, of course, for having me on the Learning Salon today. Very excited to present our recent publication and to give some sort of thoughtful background to it as well. I hope got about 15 minutes of slides here. Should I just start the screen share then? All right. Let's see. Okay, and someone say if they cannot.
We see them perfectly.
Excellent. Okay, so today I'm going to speak about the recent piece that John and I published in Nature Reviews Neuro, 2 views on the cognitive brain. It was really a pleasure and a joy and not too many tears to put this together with John. And I really had a wonderful time doing it. And I'm very excited to talk about some of what we put into that paper. So the discussion today, generally speaking, is about how neural activity might explain cognition. And I'm going to say a little bit about the history of the paper. So the paper emerged, I think John has mentioned this a little bit, from a debate between John and I about the contribution of neuroscience to explanations of the mind. And the basic question was whether or not neuroscience informs our understanding of the mind. And I took the strident position of yes. I was a little befuddled, in fact, about how you could deny it at first. But John was emphatic in that neuroscience perhaps can confirm proposed explanations. It's just one source of data, but largely does not contribute in a novel fashion with the contributions occurring mainly from psychology or computer science or economics. So in order to answer this question, we need to ask a different question first, which was how could neuroscience inform our understanding of the mind? And in order to answer this related question, we needed to establish a framework for explanations of cognition that could potentially be neurally informed. So taking some inspiration from philosophy, we first define cognition. What is cognition? It's the transformation of representations to produce behavior, where a representation is a state of the system that's about things in the world. And computation refers to operations on those representations, which are different ways of using those representations to produce behavior. So just to give an example, this is a slightly more restricted definition than is typically given in neuroscience. So for example, if I want to make plans to go on vacation, I might need to book an airplane flight. So there might be a representation in that process of an airplane, but this is a representation that's not driven, for example, by a picture of an airplane. It's one that occurs in my mind as I'm planning my vacation as a result of other thoughts, and it has a particular role in planning. And there's a variety of properties that are associated with that representation that makes it different from sort of just any internal state that could help mediate behavior. Notably, for example, the representation of airplane in my planning process is independent of external airplane stimuli. So it has this kind of detachability property. And in the paper, we go through a number of other such properties. The key here is that the properties of representations are going to be such that they can fulfill the computational roles needed to explain the cognitive capacity. So that's how we understood cognition for the paper. And in order to sort of develop our approach, we wanted to investigate how cognition might be explained. And there's oftentimes talk of levels in explanations of cognition, and we distinguished 2 different senses of levels. First, we distinguished different levels of explanation. To give an example drawn from the paper, here you have a baseball that's been thrown through and breaks a window. So why did the window break? Well, the window broke because the ball hit it. And this is a first level explainer. But the elements of this first level explainer can in turn be explained. So here at the second level, you can see additional explanatory elements that help explain what occurs in the first level. In particular, the velocity and momentum of the ball explain why the window broke. And similarly, as another complementary component of the explanation, the window broke because it was brittle. And then so on through more and more levels. So we wanted to distinguish between these different levels of explanation because we're interested in the first level explainers of cognition. That's the level at which we focused our investigation, which will make some neural facts more relevant than others. In addition to levels of explanation, there are levels of analysis. So we adopted Mars analytical framework with a few changes. Notably, we think of these as levels of analysis. So you can apply each one of these levels of analysis, the ecological, what Mar called the computational, but taking after Kim Strelny, we call the ecological level, the computational or algorithmic level, as I'll refer to it, and the implementational level. And we think that each one of these levels can describe the levels of explanation. The ecological level is the problem facing the organism and how they might solve it. So for example, a very basic problem facing an organism when they're faced with a variety of options in the environment is to choose between them. And one way that they might solve that is by tracking the values of the different options and selecting the option that has the highest value. The second level is this algorithmic level. At this level, the system's representations, the operations over those representations, and the computing architecture, like is there a CPU separated from the memory and so forth, are described. Finally, at the implementational level, the physical system, the sort of physical and biological facts in the case of the brain, are described that implement the computations and algorithms. So my presentation and our paper focuses on differences at two levels, at the computational algorithmic level and at the implementational level. And in particular, on differences at these two levels of analysis between two views on the relationship between cognition and the brain, the Sharingtonian view and the Hopfieldian view. So we had our framework for explanation, but we wanted to know how explanatory frameworks relate to the science. And we landed on views, which is sort of a general set of methods and concepts utilized in some science. And it's not, we didn't want to stick at the level of theories because we're talking about sets of concepts and how to think about neural data or psychological data or behavioral data and how those might inform explanations of cognition. We weren't talking about specific theories that have certain laws or certain models in them that can be confirmed or not by the data. And I've added sort of a speculative column here in this table because I've started thinking about exactly what a view is, and it's pretty clear that theories are falsifiable, but paradigms, which is sort of a more overarching scientific construct, are not necessarily falsifiable. And we didn't want to call the objects that we were discussing paradigms because what we were discussing was less general than a paradigm. In particular, the views we were talking about shared the concepts and shared their questions, but across paradigms, there's different concepts and different questions. Since the approaches we were discussing agree on the meaning of concepts used to construct explanations, on the relevant questions, and on the methods that can be used to answer those questions, we decided to call them views, somewhere between a theory and a paradigm. Views disagree on which concepts are more important and which methods are more important, but share a framework for those methods and concepts. So just to illustrate, the two views that we discussed, the Sharingtonian view and the Hopfieldian view, agree on what needs to be explained, the phenomena that demand explanation, which roughly correspond to the folk psychological functions, such as attention and memory and so forth. Of course, these mental phenomena may need some revision. They certainly need further characterization, more precision. Some may not survive the sort of process of scientific investigation. They may be split into many phenomena. But the two views don't disagree in the first instance on the set of initial targets. They also agree on the concepts that could be used to construct explanations. Most obviously, this applies to the neuroanatomical concepts like a neuron or a cell or a neurotransmitter, an action potential and so forth, but also on more information processing concepts like circuit or signal or code as well as mathematically inspired concepts like networks and state spaces. So, granted that they agree on so much, what are the two views and how do they differ?
Sorry, before you start, can I ask something about earlier? So you said paradigms are not falsifiable?
Paradigms, this is debated.
Scientific paradigms?
Yeah, this is debated in the scientific literature, but one common reading of Kuhn is that scientific paradigms aren't falsifiable. Instead, what happens is that the paradigms become replaced by a revolution, and it's not that the paradigm is falsified so much as it just sort of gets displaced by a new paradigm.
Right. Another thing, Jess Thompson and a lot of Melanie, Brad, and others, myself, I agree with her, is that is saying in the chat is that not everyone would equate the implementation level with neuroscience. Many would say that neuroscience can ask questions at all levels. But I just wanted to get the clarification. So thank you for the first clarification, and just wanted to voice the comment in the chat.
I see. Very good. Yeah. So those levels of analysis are meant to apply each of them to each level of explanation. So you can have implementational questions addressed by neuroscience. You can have computational or algorithmic questions addressed by neuroscience. And you can also have ecological questions. So as you can see on the screen, I think I'm on the Sharingtonian slide right now. The Sharingtonian view is characterized by certain commitments at both the algorithmic and the implementational level. In particular, the view is committed to explaining cognition as the transformation of signals by nodes in a point-to-point architecture, which nodes and connections correspond to neurons embedded in circuits and pathways in the brain. So at the algorithmic level, the Sharingtonian view explains cognition as a result of specific patterns of these node-to-node connections where individual nodes transform representations in line with what we call transfer functions in the paper. These are mathematically characterized ways that input signals are transformed into output signals by neurons. At the implementational level, the Sharingtonian details neurons, circuits, and intra and extracellular pathways like fear or anxiety circuits in the amygdala, the circuits that implement the circuits at the algorithmic level. To give a more at length illustration, here's an example of a Sharingtonian explanation for how monkeys make decisions about noisy perceptual stimuli. So here in panel A, you see a schematic of a monkey in a random dot motion task. The animal fixates, targets come on the screen. The animal is then presented with a noisy perceptual stimulus where some fraction of a field of dots, some fraction of which are moving in one direction or another. And then they make a decision about which direction the dots are moving and make a saccade to a target that corresponds to the direction of their decision. And here in panel B, you see the explanation of this decision in Sharingtonian terms. There's a representation of the motion evidence in stage 1 in area MT. It's evidence about the direction in which the dots are moving, which is carried by these MT neurons. That sends signals of this motion to area LIP here in stage 2. Neurons in area LIP integrate the motion evidence from MT to form a representation of the summation of that evidence. And then this representation hits a threshold here in stage 3, signaling downstream action selection and initiation. So here you have a dedicated series of nodes and pathways with particular neural transfer functions, such as integration, that transform the motion input into the response. In contrast to the Sharingtonian view, the Hopfieldian view is committed to representational spaces with computation cast as transformation between or movement within those spaces. Networks of neurons and mass measures of neural activity implement those spaces and those transformations. So at the algorithmic level, you have these representational spaces and the ways that cognitive systems can move through them or transform them. And these spaces and that movement is implemented by neural spaces, such as population trajectories through a neural space. And these are assessed using mass measures of neural activity, such as population recordings of many neurons, which is well illustrated, for example, by trajectories in the population space in PMD during a reaching task in monkeys. Just to go give a slightly more in-depth example of the Hopfieldian view, consider this explanation of recall and recognition. Again, a monkey is presented with fixation, and then a picture, and then a delay, an interstimulus interval, followed by another picture, and finally a delay. And then there's two ways that their memory is assessed in this kind of framework. There is the recognition task here in condition B, where they're presented either with a match sequence of a picture, a delay, and then another picture that matches the sample sequence, or they're presented with a non-match test sequence of a different picture, a delay, and a final picture. And they have to indicate whether the sequence with which they were presented is match or non-match. In the recall task, the animal is presented with 3 pictures simultaneously, and they just have to make movements to indicate the sequence in which the samples were presented. In this case, the flowers followed by, oh no, I've forgotten, this is the most adorable animal. Well, yes, this, what's it called? I forget.
It's a
Thank you,
capybara.
capybara, yes, and they're adorable. If you have not checked them out on YouTube, highly recommend. Okay. The dimensionality of this representational, so that neurons were recorded in the prefrontal cortex, and the dimensionality of the neural population correlated both with the number of neurons that were included in the population analysis and whether the trial was correct or incorrect, an error trial. So this dimensionality note is a feature of the population and is not reducible to individual neurons. Hence the explanation, this type of explanation, is not available to the Sharingtonian. So on the left panel here on the x-axis is number of neurons that were included in the dimensionality analysis, and relevantly for our discussion, on the left y-axis is the number of binary classifications that can be made. And on correct trials here in dark blue, you see a greater dimensionality of that population than on error trials. Notably, if you remove the linear mixed selectivity proportion of responses and keep only the nonlinear mixed selectivity portions of these responses and rerun that same analysis, you get what you see here on the left, which is this increase in the dimensionality of the neural activity for correct trials, but a relatively flat dimensionality for error trials. There is no difference between correct and error trials if you only assess the linear component of the neural responses. These increases in dimensionality are taken to be required to perform basic logical operations such as classification of task conditions, which is what occurs on this example. In the left panel here, you have a plane that cannot be used to classify items using an exclusive OR rule. There's no way to draw a line along this plane that separates the yellow from the red, a straight line, I should say. Whereas if you shift to 3 dimensions, this does allow for a plane, in this case, to be drawn that can adequately classify your yellow dots from the red ones. These differences in dimensionality of the representational space are reflected in changes in the dimensionality of the neural space, and hence they exemplify this Hopfieldian approach. Okay, so those are the 2 views. We do make a case that the Hopfieldian view is, at the end of the paper, is to be preferred over the Sharingtonian one. I'm not going to go at great length because I've run out of time here, I see. But I will say one thing, which is that especially in the last 5 or 10 years, what you're seeing is an increased use of looking at lower dimensional spaces that are embedded in high dimensional neural activity. And that's sort of what is depicted here, where you have N neurons in a high dimensional space, and you have this sort of lower dimensional projection. And in one condition, you have an excursion along a lower dimensional dimension that's embedded in this high dimensional neural activity in this first representational space that becomes integrated and transformed into a bifurcation in the second representational space, but still in along a low dimensional manifold. And there are just so many examples of this in the past 5 years of these types of explanations where you see differences in task conditions in virtue of differences in low dimensional manifolds and high dimensional neural activity, including for working memory, value computations, temporal interval estimation, motor planning, and so forth. And so it's these sorts of features of neural activity that play a central explanatory role in cognition, and that cannot be described in the Sharingtonian view. So this is the positive case we make for being a Hopfieldian. So we argue that the Hopfieldian view is the most promising approach to take to construct an explanation of cognition. And in particular, this new view on cognition provides insight into those neurofunctional properties of the brain that hopefully can yield explanations into cognition. And so the brain can, in fact, inform our understanding of the mind. Okay, so I want to thank my friend and colleague and co-author, John Krakauer, who was just an absolute joy and inspiration during this process. And I guess we can open it up to questions. And so let me see how to do this. Is it stop sharing? Is that what I do here? Let's see. Oh, you did, okay.
Yeah. So thanks. If you can't see, Ida and John are both laughing wildly.
Very good. Okay, so I don't know. I couldn't see any of you during that. So yeah, I hope that was maybe a lot. But I'm eager to hear what everyone thinks and to have a debate.
Well, it's not a debate as much as just discussions about similar topics. I don't know if you see the chat. If you open your chat, you will see that people are clapping hands.
Excellent.
Yeah, so usually I would say, John, would you like to go first? But I guess like in this case, it's kind of like.
I'm not, just an announcement. Yes, Ida, I am going to forego the usual role because obviously it'd be strange for me to ask David questions. And second, I think it'd be great for you and Jobo and then give more time to all the great guests we seem to have today.
I think that was
yeah,
Mazvita's here.
So I'm gonna Mazvita. I'll answer some questions when David is no longer able to use his Wonder Woman bracelets to full effect. But I will forego.
Yeah, Mazvita says looking forward to John's questions for himself. We should have a session about that. I think I want Jovo to go first, but I just want to ask one clarification thing before Jovo goes first. So what is the goal of this paper?
So this is an interesting question because there's the goal of the paper in the sense of how it emerged from this debate that John and I were having about whether or not neuroscience can actually say something about novel something, a new something, give us new insight into how cognition is related to the brain. Is it really just confirmatory? It's just the models are really inspired by other disciplines, AI, economics, and so forth. And then we use neuroscience data to confirm or disconfirm, but there isn't really novel insight. And one of the intentions behind the paper is to really try to show how there is this kind of movement in the field that is providing novel insights into the computations and representations. And that kind of novel source of insight into the relationship between the mind and the brain is really coming from these Hopfieldian type of experiments and investigations. So that was one intent. And then a second intent was, of course, to situate this new style, let's say, as I put it in the presentation, as we put in the paper, this new view on the relationship between cognition and the brain in the historic literature. You know, how does it contrast with a classic way of doing neuroscience, which we label the Sharingtonian way? So there's, in two respects, the intention first was to illustrate one way that neuroscience can uniquely maybe even contribute to our understanding of cognition, and secondly, to situate the studies and models and methods that are being used to provide that new insight in the historic sort of development of neuroscience and in the field.
And by new, you mean 40-year-old?
Yeah. Well, new relative to the Sharingtonian. Yeah, that's right.
Exactly. Okay, so Jovo, go first. And thank you for that clarification.
Thanks. Thanks, Ida. Thanks, David. You know, I want to say before asking questions about this that, you know, I've known David longer than John, maybe longer than Ida even has known David, because we met in 2012 when I was a postdoc at Duke. And I just want to say, like, when I got there, I literally knew nobody. I went there to be in the statistics and math department, and somehow found David and started talking to me about neuroscience and meditation, and he was my only friend there for a long time. And it was really meaningful to me. I don't know, David, if you know this, but something really terrible happened to somebody that I knew and loved very deeply a few months after I got to Duke. And I had to go travel for a week to get and help them. And I came back. It was just so comforting when I came back. You and I went to dinner. And it wasn't like a big deal, like we just talked about whatever, but it was so meaningful to me to just have a friend that I could connect with after that in a place that was foreign to me. So I'll always remember that. It was really meaningful to me.
That said, David, I'm now going to trash you.
Correct.
That's good. No, I've now been built up. Now is the time.
Yeah. And so Ida and I were talking earlier, and she was saying she didn't want to be critical. And I said, I mean, what I was thinking is the closer I am with people, the more critical I am of them. Partially because I think, we have an understanding that it's criticism out of love and support, and curiosity rather than anything else. So the first question is really a kind of a clarification question. And, in a sense, it doesn't matter, but I'm curious your take. Like, a lot of the stuff you wrote is kind of well established. And I'm curious, like, which parts of it is a new thing that you're kind of saying, this is new, and people might argue with it, and the other parts of it are like well established and we all agree to?
In the paper, you're saying that's yeah.
In the paper, in the talk, I mean,
so that's I appreciate that question. So certainly our contention in part was to bring together multiple threads that might have existed in disparate places in literature, especially with regard to bringing to bear certain considerations about representation onto these and more sophisticated notions of representation inspired by some of the work in philosophy onto explanations of cognition or the factors that might go into the choice of explanations of cognition. We felt that the different levels of explanation, focusing on the first level explainers, for example, had not been super clear in the literature or well characterized. And we also felt that this somewhat novel cognitive explanatory role for these kinds of state space diagrams also hadn't been well characterized. How did they contribute to explanations of cognition in a somewhat novel way? And that had to do with making clear, kind of connecting in a visual form almost, how the population trajectories are implementing computations and being able to contribute to explanations of cognition. So, and then there's sort of some of the perhaps less apparent, but certainly intended takeaways, which I mentioned to Ida, which had to do with situating these recent developments in population style analyses in the history of the field and comparing them to much older styles of doing neuroscience. Styles of doing neuroscience, I should add, that are still prevalent in many different labs and in application to many different brain regions and many different functions. So I think in sum, we, of course, our goal was to, and it was a Nature Reviews neuroscience piece, so we had to cover a lot of review and to set things up that way, but both in articulating certain novel aspects of an explanatory framework, in articulating the way in which Hopfieldian type explanations are novel or present novel ways of understanding the brain, and also trying to, and this is, of course, sort of a theme of the paper is less explicit, to characterize how this way of doing neuroscience actually may give us novel insight into the cognitive functions that that the brain implements.
I'm going to just take an opportunity, just if I may piggyback, just because I do think it's really important, because Ida asked the same question, and I think first of all, I would actually disagree and agree that, of course, one can tie together many threads, but actually, there is a difference between sort of the Sharingtonian approach, where the neuron as a mechanism in the Craver sense was actually an ontological object that actually was incorporated into your sequential thinking about a mechanism. So, for example, the stretch reflex, which we mentioned, right? You can actually, using the neuron as an object in your explanation, go from the muscle spindle through the 1A afferent to the interneuron, to the motor neuron, back to the muscle fiber. Okay, so you can actually construct in your head an explanation with a physical neural object. Okay, so that is what we would call a neuron as evidence, as mechanism, sorry, neuron as mechanism. But when you start recording from neurons to confirm a behaviorally inspired model, a correlate, that neuron is now acting as a confirmatory, is playing a confirmatory role on your behavioral task level analysis. You're no longer physically introducing that neuron into a circuit. You're going, ah, yes, I know why that neuron in LIP is actually working in a diffusion to bound model. You have no idea how it's configured and wired up necessarily. I mean, David gave an example, but it's nevertheless useful neural confirmation for a task level explanation. So there's a transition that some people miss between a neuron being an ontological mechanistic object that you incorporate into your explanation versus being a source of confirmation for your explanatory object, which is actually a task-based model. And the point we were trying to make is that that transition of neuron as object of mechanism to being a source of evidence sometimes gets missed. And what we were trying to say here is that if you treat neurons as a form of brain behavior to complement with a body's behavior, you have two sources of behavior. You have neural behavior and you have body behavior. And they're two sources of behavior that you can combine into a model. And as David, I think, is saying, maybe the model will be discovery-based, may actually be more insightful as a model because you sent out all your hounds. You sent out behavioral evidence hounds, and you sent out neural evidence hounds. But in those two cases, you're not making a mechanistic claim. You're trying to sort of confirm and constrain a model. And so all we're saying is those tend to get collapsed.
Yes, and actually drawing that distinction, which John just put so well and articulately, was a result of a lot of fighting between the two of us in the early days of this project, of trying to understand even how could the brain play a role, neuroscience play a role outside of providing confirmation for these models, which are constructed under other auspices as a result of other influences in other disciplines. And so, you know, it was not obvious, and it wasn't until we sort of dove into the variety, the zoo of different types of explanations that are provided in neuroscience until we could arrive at this conciliant position where we're able to divvy up what kinds of explanations are provided and why some actually end up perhaps providing novel insight.
I mean, Yael Niv in her latest paper, very beautifully articulates this, that, in terms of insight, discovery, she makes the case, I think convincingly, that it tends to happen more out of modeling behavior, which you then sort of go, yes, you confirm that there are neurons that fire in relation to some parameter of your model, but that it's actually quite challenging. And it's not, we're talking about cognition here, remember, not all of neuroscience, to make fresh qualitative discovery that isn't somehow yoked to task level analysis, which then feeds back into a confirmatory role for the neural evidence. That's, and of course I agree with Yael overall about that, but it's just an awareness of the distinction, with obviously without wanting to be forever absolute. Maybe there will be a Sharingtonian neuron A connects to neuron B, connects to neuron C, connects to neuron D, stretch reflex like understanding of cognition, but I think that's quite challenging.
I think it also depends on the brain area and the cognitive function.
So while John was saying that, Ida made a face, and I want to know what that face meant, because I don't think she agreed. And I'm curious what specifically she disagreed with.
Oh no, it was just a confused face, and I don't remember what it was about, to be honest.
Okay, so we'll move on then. So I'm gonna TLDR this paper, if I may, and I want you to push back and say what I've missed. The TLDR, and it's kind of the same for what John's little summary is. You guys think the right way to do it is MAR level 1, 2, 3 for cognition, whereas for non-cognitive things like sensory motor stuff, you think maybe 1, 3, 2.
Sorry, what is the ordering of the levels meant to indicate?
Oh, one is ecological, computational, two is algorithmic, three is implementation. So just like what John was saying, like you think to get at cognition, we should do ecological and then go to algorithmic and then do some kind of implementation level analysis. Whereas for sensory motor things, you didn't really talk about this so much in the talk, but in the paper you did, and John mentioned it a little bit, you can go from the behavior right to the implementation level, skipping the algorithmic level, and that the implementation will inform the algorithm, just like, you know, in various reflexes and stuff. And I've talked with Mala Murphy, basically convinced me of this when I've talked to her about the Drosophila connectome, because if I'm interpreting what she said correctly, she uses it all the time to infer algorithms of how the fly may be doing things in ways that I think what you and John are saying is will be very difficult to do in the mouse connectome, for example, because the cognitive properties you want to explain aren't so obviously tethered to the physical connections because of some multiple realizability thing or some other kinds of complications like that.
So, and the order in which the 1, 2, 3 or 1, 3, 2, that's meant to suggest sort of like an order of discovery. So for example, I start with the ecological problem facing the organism and the fly, and then I go straight to the implementation. I start to characterize the actual biophysiological properties of that implementation. And then on the basis of those properties, I make an inference about what the algorithm is. Whereas for more cognitive, more sophisticated, dare I say, phenomena, we're going to instead start with the ecological problem, then go to the algorithmic computational, then we'll turn to the implementational. Is that right?
That's what I'm asking. Is that what you're saying?
Well, it's just one subtlety on that is that David pointed out two different level diagrams, a level of explanation diagram and a levels of realization diagram. And they tend to get collapsed and they're not the same, okay? And so you can be Marian, completely Marian in a Sharingtonian viewpoint. Right. In other words, you can be just as Marian about a dendrite and a circuit as you can be about cognition. Right. You can have a implementational and a algorithmic and computational view of the dendrite, and people do. So it's very important not to collapse Marian levels with the ontological objects with which one is doing explanation.
Right. And that's why we characterize those as levels of analysis. Right. And I'll also add that we didn't make any remonstrations. We didn't take any stand on the order of discovery here. It seems to me, it could be plausible that you go from the problem facing the organism to the implementation in the neural spaces and looking directly at the neural data and looking in particular at low dimensional projections or low dimensional spaces embedded in this high dimensional neural data, and then make inferences about the algorithm. In fact, I don't know, but based on just reading this, there's a wonderful paper out of the Jaziri lab, which has been producing a series of, in my opinion, excellent investigations of temporal interval estimation that have exemplified in many ways the Hopfieldian approach. And one of those papers, which is Salon et al. 2019 in Neuron, they kind of do that order, the very order you're saying holds for the fly, where they look at what needs to be done, which is to estimate different temporal intervals, and then they turn to their neural recordings and they look at what the low dimensional descriptions of the high dimensional neural data look like, and then they characterize that and then make inferences about the sort of algorithmic level. And in particular, they make inferences about the existence of something that they call neural speed, which is a variable that's being encoded in these populations. And that seems to be driving at an algorithmic level the behavior. So I don't think, I'm pretty neutral on the order of discovery here. I think you can start kind of almost anywhere, and I think it's all sort of interacts and can inform each other.
I actually in the other paper agreed with what you said, Jovo. I did actually make a stand about what the directionality of the Marian level work should be. But and I think it's very important for others to hear this. Mehrdad wrote a very nice review about this new approach, right? And he made the case, if you remember, in the introduction to that article he wrote, he talked about understanding clocks and saying that the right ontological object to work out what a clock is doing are cogs and springs, right? So in other words, he makes the case very beautifully that you have to find the right sized object with which to do useful work, working out what's going on. And it would not be the right thing to do to talk about the atomic structure of the cogs, or the springs, right? You'd be going down too low. And so the point being made here is, what's the right ontological object to do thinking with about a system? And that's orthogonal to the Marian dissection, okay? And I think the big point being made here is that when you get to cognition, the ontological object is a derived one from a population of neurons, rather than looking at a circuit with exact connectivity and going, that neuron's connected to that, neuron's connected to that. Thinking must be happening, right? Like Leibniz said, would be so difficult if you went into a windmill, right? So it's very important not to conflate those two different notions of level. Even though I agree that in the behavior paper from years ago, I kind of did make the case that one should go 1, 2, 3. But that's not the point being made here.
So wait a second. So I think in order to make sure this doesn't turn into an extension of you two's personal conversations, it might be helpful to bring up what Mihai is asking in the chat, and others are sort of +1ing. It seems like various people are asking this in different ways. Mihai asks, I think it would be helpful if David could reiterate what the two views are in a couple of sentences. My understanding is also that it's mainly a matter of dimensionality, but I don't feel like I really got it. Of course, the abstract of the paper, of the review paper, mentions them, but I'm a little sympathetic to Mihai. So if you could sort of reiterate the differances between them and their relationship to dimensionality, because I think earlier there were other comments in the chat about the fact that so another person, Daniel H, said, I feel I missed this during the presentation, but what are the arguments for Hopfieldian creating better explanations? Is it just related to higher dimensionality? And another person had asked, I don't remember who it was in the chat earlier, whether the Sharingtonian is just lower dimensional explanations. So it would be great if you could sort of clarify the two views and mention their relationship with each other with regards to dimensionality. And if that's not the most important feature, then highlight what would that important feature be. John, feel free to give the answer to if you want.
So I'll briefly characterize the two views. So they are distinguished at both the algorithmic and the implementational level. So the Sharington view at the algorithmic level characterizes these systems in terms of nodes and the connections between them. Signals are passed between these pathways between nodes, and the nodes take in their inputs and transform them in a particular fashion and then pass on those outputs to other signals. Importantly, the representations exist at the single individual nodes. So that's where computation is performed. We note in the paper that you could potentially also get computation by reconfiguring the connections, but to date, there hasn't been an approach that's characterized that in any robust fashion. At the implementational level, the Sharingtonian focuses on neurons and specific pathways and circuits and the ways that cells are connected to each other. That really does matter for the Sharingtonian. In contrast, the Hopfieldian focuses on this notion of representational spaces, of energy landscapes, sometimes you hear them called, where you have a characterization of the system and the dimensions of variation in the system, and those dimensions have representational significance. So there's a classic example of this from Paul Churchland, where he talks about face space. You can imagine space for faces as a 3D space where, for example, you might have the distance from, let's say, the nose to the mouth as one of the dimensions. You might have the space between the eyes as a second dimension, and so on. And you characterize each face as a point in that space. And then that's how, and then the occupation of some point in that space is the representation. And where it is in that space is where it gets its content. And then computation has to do with movement either within that space, if you're morphing, let's say, from face to face, or it has to do with movement between representational spaces. So you might have one representational space that's faces, as I described, and then there's going to be some movement, some transformation of that space into another space, let's say, for names. And so there will be that point for a particular face might move somewhere else into a different point in the name space. At the implementational level for the Hopfieldian, those spaces are implemented. They're lower dimensional embeddings of a much higher dimensional neural space. So the dimensionality matters insofar as it's a characterization of the relationship between the representational spaces and the neural spaces. But you could characterize Sharingtonian circuits in terms of dimensionality as well. It's just they don't play a central role in the explanation of cognition as a transformation of representation, whereas dimensionality, changes in dimensionality and the dimensionality of particular spaces does matter for the explanation of cognition in terms of computations over representations for the Hopfieldian. So that's, I don't know if that was, did that answer the question? Was that?
It wasn't very brief, so I don't know, but just to be clear, so I'm a little confused about all of this because phase spaces that exist in social psychology without any notion of neurons is not Hopfieldian per se. And as I saw Hopfield, David Tank, and all of the labs that were related to Hopfield in Princeton, they actually care about neurons, and most of them were doing 2-photon imaging. So I'm not sure if it's the case that, so I'm not done, John. I'm not sure if it is the case that there is a broadly, yeah, so there is a, so I'm thinking about Hopfield networks and, you know, all of the legacy of that, which is very much sort of related to connectionism. And at the end of the day, the tools of connectionism are nodes and connections between them. So the way that it's sort of, oh, Sharrington says it's nodes and connections, but Hopfield says, Hopfield actually does use nodes and connections, but then the dynamics between them, yes, generate some other spaces, and that can be studied. But the nodes and connections matter in the Hopfield view as well. So that's, I think, I see that Jova is nodding too. So I think that's maybe a little bit the part.
No, I mean, they do matter, Ida. But the thing is that the point is that, and it's really important, is that it's not that they don't matter. It's just that they become second-level explainers, right? In other words, what we're talking about is when it comes to the stretch reflex, the connectivity is the first-level explainer. When it starts coming to cognitive phenomena, where you derive these population-level objects, the cogs and springs. No one's saying that atoms that make up cogs and springs don't matter. Of course they do. And it's obviously the case that in the end, the reason why you can construct these multidimensional spaces is must be in part due to some connectivity property. But all we're saying is that the connectivity, whilst for stretch reflexes can be the first level explainer, it can't be the first level explainer for cognition. It becomes the second level explainer.
So Melanie is saying in the chat that Hopfield is not Hopfieldian, and Rosa asks whether what you're describing is about single versus population coding.
Right. So I was going to add something basically that sounds like what Melanie picked up on, which is that the label, which came up very early on in my debates with John. I started, was like, you can think there's this Sharingtonian explanation. There was this other type. And for me, when I read Hopfield, I was very moved by the energy landscapes and basins of attraction aspect of his work. And that's why I labeled it Hopfieldian. So it's a term that maybe is not as descriptive as it should be, and I'll freely admit that. But that's where the origin of the two terms came from. And then this,
right, that's the property of all dynamical systems, basically.
Yeah, that's
okay.
right. Yeah. So systems identification analysis uses this notion of a state space. It's not new to neuroscience or anything like that. But what is, it seems in our estimation to be novel here is that that's the right first level explainer for cognition, as John mentioned. And then when you want to get to the details of the connections, then you've actually dropped down to the second level explainer of and only indirectly explain cognition. Now, the other question was Rosa's question, which I've now forgotten. So what was that question?
Whether the main point is between single neuron versus population coding.
Right. So we have a little bit of a statement about this in the paper where we note that a better description might be, instead of single neuron, or what's classically called the neuron doctrine, we call it the neuron plus doctrine, because it seemed to us that no one really thought it was going to be individual neurons. No single neuron captures the mind. It's always going to be neural circuits, connections between neurons and specific functions that are being performed. over inputs at nodes in these networks to provide outputs. It's not necessarily, and so you have a population in the sense that you're going to refer to lots of neurons in these networks. It has to do with whether or not the specific connections between these nodes matter and what the relevant vehicle, to use a term from philosophy, for the representation is. So in other words, what's the relevant object in the brain to which we assign these kinds of representational significance? Is it the individual neuron, or is it going to be or the neural population when we think of the neural population as the specific connections and network of nodes? Or is it going to be something else, some sort of abstraction away from that, what we call a neural space in the article, and that's what's going to carry representational significance. And that's one of the major differences between the two views.
Sorry, what was the difference? So one of them says it's the connection of neurons. So you think the neural space is the difference? Is that what you're claiming?
Yeah, so the representational significance on the Sharingtonian view is going to be carried by the individual units themselves, the nodes. That's the unit of representation. That's the level of description.
Sorry, is it the unit or is it the collection with their connections?
So the explanatory object is going to be the neurons and their connections, but the semantic significance is going to be carried by each individual node, and the different nodes will have different semantic significance. Whereas,
so like grandmother neurons.
Exactly, or even more than that. I think in the paper we talk about like something like super grandmother neurons, where snow is white. That entire semantic complex of snow and white and the predication relation of is might all be carried at the level of the node. And we talk about how that's kind of wildly implausible, I think, is the comment that we make in the paper.
And was that one of the sharing? And this is because Sherrington said that.
This is not historical attribution. This is the label is inspired by the types of explanations that were in turn inspired by the original explanation of the reflex from Sherrington.
Sherrington and Hopfield for us, Ida, are like the hedgehog and the fox, right? It's just a label. And I also want to give an analogy which may or may not help. If you're a political theorist or a sociologist, you'll usually talk at the level of institutions and parties. Does this country have a right-wing populist party? Does it have a left-wing party? Do they have a parliament? What are their institutions? So the objects of explanation for a sociologist or a political theorist tend to be aggregate institutions like parties and parliaments. No one denies that they are made up of human beings, individual human beings, but the counter that you use in the explanations that you do is an aggregate one. If you're a psychologist, to a degree, and you care more about what's going on in the mind of single individuals. So in other words, when it comes to sociology, institutions, society, or political science, parties, the first level explainer is usually some aggregate object. When it comes to psychology, the object is a human being, and on you go. So in other words, every discipline, and
I'm not sure I agree with that. Just want to throw that out.
But every discipline has its not just epistemological choice; it has its ontologically more effective object. And all we're saying is that neuroscience is kind of a difficult discipline because it's neurons all the way down. One can make the mistake of thinking that the ontological object that works for a circuit for movement or an eye movement will remain the same ontological object when you start to get into cognition, rather than saying you're just going to have to move up to a different kind of first level explainer.
It sounds to me like there's kind of two complementary arguments being made. One is for cognition, we want first level explainers. I think your claim is for explaining cognitive behaviors, we want the first level explainers to be neural activity. Second level is neural connectivity versus, say, sensory motor behaviors where, I'm not sure you're saying this, but I think you are. First level explainers are perfectly fine as connectivity.
So it's not just connectivity though, because it's also like the nodal activations and the way that they're activated as a result, as a function of their inputs. That's also an important aspect, yeah.
Okay, so that's one thing you're saying. And then there's this whole other thing about whether the objects doing the work are individual neurons or populations of neurons. It's just a separate, another thing that you could or could not include in the first thing.
It's not another thing in so much that as we pointed out in the notion of emergence, the ontological, you can't talk about a parliament of one or a political party of one. There are ontological objects that sociologists care about, like institutions and parties, that are emergent phenomena when you have lots of human beings together. So Rosa asked the question, so the first level explainer for a sociologist is an institution, right? So in other words, we're just saying, and it just turns out that to make an institution like an ant mound, it's a population level phenomenon, right? There are some things that only, as in the example that David gave, that happen when you have populations. You can't get it at the level of single neurons, right? So then they're related in so much that the ontological object, the first level explainer for sociologists is different from a psychologist. And some of these first level explainers have to be built out of aggregates. So they're related.
So Rosa was asking a lot of interesting questions, and also Tim Barron. So we're just going to have to, and Jess Thompson. So we're going to have to go slowly through all of our guests. Hi, Ben. It's great to have you, and we're excited to hear your thoughts. Your question was the most highly voted.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for having me. Can you hear me? Awesome. Yeah, David, hey, cool to see you on here. So yeah, my question, I guess, is a little bit actually aside of the main thesis, because I'm sympathetic, as I said, to the thesis about the exponans of cognition. But you also took a stand in the paper on defining cognition itself as computation over representations in the brain. And I'll say why that seems sort of funny to me, but I guess my first question is just why you would sort of want to commit to that, as you seem to put yourself on the other side of, like, some people in philosophy that I know you're familiar with, like in the extended and embodied cognition sort of camp. So why do that by definition if the Hopfieldian kind of neural spaces could be neural plus environment, neural plus body spaces? Could you have something that still looks Hopfieldian but that encompasses people of that embodied and extended sort of camp? Or is the reason to go in for the cognition definition that you go in for, like, is that dialectic, or is there some? So yeah, I guess just a word about that, because we discovered the brain to be important in the ways that it is. So if cognition or thinking or the things that like make this engine go were something that people before we had neuroscience could have tried to investigate in some sense, even if they were doing it wrongly, then why by definition should we call the representations being internal to the neural architecture? Anyway, that's my spiel.
So it was perhaps not surprising in retrospect, but when we sort of did our tweet thread about this on Twitter, the most avid, upset maybe response was from the extended embodied cognition people, who basically said, ugh, another representational theory, what's going on here? I think there's, I have three components to my response. First, we adopted this sort of representational framework to give us a nice structuring for what we thought cognition could be, that was philosophically motivated. Of course, computational theory of mind, I think, is still the dominant approach to understanding computation, and one that also we felt that both Hopfieldians and Sharingtonians camps could get on board with, that we could relate to the computational theory of mind. And so we didn't actually argue for the computational theory of mind in the paper. This is my second point, which is that we kind of just took it on as a presupposition in order to structure the debate in a certain way. And my third point in reply is that I don't think that the embodied, and here I'm really laying myself out because I haven't put this in print anywhere, but I actually don't find the embodied extended cognition camp to be a productive research program, to use some philosophical terms. I don't think it does a good job at accommodating existing results, and I don't think it does a great job at providing novel great job. It does in some cases. I don't want to say that it's totally not interesting, but it doesn't provide novel explanations for cognitive phenomena. And in particular, Rob Rupert has a really wonderful book where he sort of deconstructs these views, and he points out that insofar as there is explanatory content to these explanations, it looks like you can capture those explanatory insights fully within a computational framework. And I found that book to be rather dispositive. I thought it really made the case against those views. So I don't know if, John, you want to add anything?
No, I actually completely agree. I mean, I agree with that position in that book. I think the 4E approach for cognition of the kind that we're interested in, and, Ida talking about prefrontal cortex, in my view, I find it a bit of a dead end as a project, the whole 4E approach. I really, really, really feel like there's no there. Now, there are forms of it that I think are quite interesting from the sensory motor side, and sort of the work that Melanie, help me. What's the name of the person at Santa Fe Institute who's doing all that great work on neuromorphic computation? Nihad Ai's work is beautiful. So there's a form of it that I like, but for the cognition of the kind that we intuitively are talking about, I just agree with that position. I just don't think it does much work intellectually.
Wait, what's a dead end again? Just so
I don't think that the 4E, the enactivism, I just don't find that very useful for higher cognition.
That's extended, embodied, inactive. What's the fourth E?
I think it's ecstatic.
Extended. Wait, guys,
Extended,
we don't disrespect. So I think we shouldn't disrespect theories, but also I just want to say, to Ben's point, actually, Ben, in robotics, it turns out there's a lot of stuff related to embodied cognition that are working out very well. And they lead to learning higher level representations that are multimodal. For instance, there is a beautiful work, formerly someone who finished their PhD at Columbia, CS in fact, where there is a robot hand and it needs to pick something up, but the vision that it has from the top gets obstructed by its own hand. So at some point it needs to use touch in order to estimate vision of the object. And so it needs to develop these kinds of embodied vision, basically. And in that kind of work, and as well as the sort of the resurgence of the notion of affordances very much in various deep learning and algorithmic works that are in machine learning. It seems like there are aspects of the kind of embodied cognition tradition that seem like they are definitely very relevant. And I just want to remind everyone that there's like a progression in the philosophy of mind and its reflection in psychology and other work that have been that were going on. Early 20th century, we had the behaviorist dogma, where it was just input, output, whatever was in the middle didn't matter as much. Then we have cognitivism with Tolman and others. And cognitivism is awesome, but embodied cognition, albeit maybe it needs some revised form or it needs some sort of new approaches to it, it does keep into account not only just the embodied interaction of the individual, but how the world, extended mind ideas are that how the world might become a part of my cognition, and it's not just all inside the brain. And because of the examples that I just mentioned, like the robotic example or the examples of assistive technologies that we use, at least in the AI world, those themes are not considered a dead end, especially since, for instance, at some point we're going to have robot arms that are interacting with the brain and the nervous system entirely. For people who have like amputations, or maybe even just for fun devices, in some decades we're finally going to have them, if not now, but soon. And so I'm not sure if I would call that a dead end, and I wouldn't even call that a dead end for understanding higher level representations. Because there's also this idea, there was at least in philosophy, this idea that thinking might be an abstracted form of the interactions and actions that one might do, one might like learn in life. And so learning to do more actions and seeing embodied interactions with the world might expand sort of the ways that people abstract things and think abstract thoughts. So I think I'm a little bit more, I'm a bit less on the camp. I might value a little bit more the embodied cognition approach.
I think that was a really nice corrective, and let me revise my claim then. So I don't want to, and I think a lot of that work actually is really great. But what I'm not convinced by is that it actually is an alternative, as opposed to providing like a different way of understanding internal representations. But there's still internal representations, for example. But it might be that it is a genuine alternative, and I'm wrong. But my bet is that what's really going on, and this is sort of, I'm kind of mimicking Rob Rupert's book here, because this is the kind of argument he makes in his book, where he says, look, if you look at this work, it isn't a robust ontological difference. There isn't, what's really going on is that they're using some of the more classic computational tools. They're just expanding the contents that are being represented, or they're taking into account more inputs or something. But I might be wrong. So
sorry, the person that you named, is that person a scientist, a philosopher?
Is a philosopher of cognitive science at Colorado. Yeah, Robert Rupert.
Okay, got it. So if you add the link,
I just added it. I just added the
Thank you. So to that, I would reply that let me look at it from the perspective of someone who does cognitive neuroscience and reinforcement learning models. Building a reinforcement learning model that's behaviorist is different from a reinforcement learning model that's cognitivist, and it's different from a reinforcement learning model that's embodied. The kinds of representations that they use will be different. And the kinds of framework, reinforcement learning framework, or neural networks that you might need in order to be able to build them is different. Will all of them have some neurons representing something? Yes, if that's the level that somebody wants to say. I disagree with the philosopher that I haven't read their book, but just a little bit that you, if this is the case, the view that you ascribe to them, the sentence that you ascribe to them, I disagree that it is the case that all of these are the same, unless they're interested in, are we talking about dualism now, which that's not my claim. So if that's the level of ontological difference they're talking about, then that's a different story.
Ida, I can answer. I can give it to you. So you understand. The question you're asking is...
Thank you for helping me understand, but let me just...
I'm just telling you what Robert Rupert said.
But John, can you let Ida finish, please?
Yeah, let me finish, please. I'm not as much interested in Robert Rupert, like blowing up a new name and just changing the topic is an approach, but let's focus on the main point. The main point here is whether there is a difference between these approaches. And I don't think that all of them having some representations inside the brain is the right level of saying, okay, there is no advances, because there is a huge difference, both philosophically in terms of application and model building and the kinds of experiments one may run in behaviorism, cognitivism, and post-cognitivism including embodied cognition.
All I was going to say is the position that we're objecting to, which is out there, is when the enactivist, the 4E position, is A, a substitute, and B, is explicitly anti-representationalist, right? So in other words, when it's what you're saying, Ida, which implicitly was that there were representational approaches, right? When they combine, like Nihat, I does it, that, where you combine the external world, the body, and you basically farm out certain computations that don't require representation. Fantastic. But the objection is when it's the anti-representationalist stance of the 4E position that is a non-starter. You can't do without representation. If you combine them, then absolutely we agree that they'll probably end up being distributed between the brain, the body, and the world.
That's great. Thank you for that clarification. I empathize with disagreeing with anti-representationalists, but not all embodied cognition, either philosophies or models or cognitive programs are anti-representationalists. So I'm just going to stop because I want Ben to continue.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in one more time. I mean, it was along those lines that there was kind of an assumed familiarity with embodied cognition, where in the background, in fact, some people who wave that banner disagree about whether and to what extent representations are involved. And it's just, that's a little bit messy. But insofar as you think that there are those cases that are compelling, or maybe whatever you think it's a dead end, or you find more or less compelling some of these cases where the environment seems to be involved, if you can get a grip on some cases, like this is something I would think John would be down with, that you can get a grip on some cases like planning, explicit recall, imagination. Okay, so those are my paradigm cases of cognition. What do the explanans look like? And then you go in for the rest of your paper. And you can do that without, pissing off Andy Clark or whoever it is. But that's the thought. But you answered the point well anyway.
Cool. Before anybody else asks anything, I just want to make sure, Ida, that our format was slightly different today. I want to make sure you feel like you had ample time to ask questions also.
That's okay. I really want to hear Melanie right now. And I'm asking as we go, so that's okay.
Thanks, David, for this talk, and thanks. I read your paper too, which I very much enjoyed. But I, like Ben, I got kind of stuck on the very first sentence of the abstract, which is cognition can be defined as computation over meaningful representations. Okay, so, and one question that didn't seem to be addressed is like, how are these representations formed in the first place? And is that part of cognition? Is that really the core of cognition? And is the formation of representations, which kind of starts perhaps in your Sharingtonian world with Sharingtonian explanations, when does it actually kind of cross over into being Hopfieldian in your terms, to be that, you know, what are those, that formation process, how do we explain that?
This is an awesome question that I will admit I haven't paid a lot of time to or attention to. And when you first asked it, I thought you were asking a question to me about ontogeny and development. But now, yeah, now I understand. And I don't have a good answer. I'm not sure. There's, insofar as certain circuits in the brain or in certain organisms are clearly Sharingtonian, and if we accept that certain systems are best explained, certain cognitive functions are best explained in a Hopfieldian fashion, there is this question of how do you get from one to the other? Like, where does that come from evolutionarily? Is it, my intuition also is that there isn't going to be a hard boundary between these. There's going to be some of the, like, maybe even a wide range of intermediate cases. Maybe it's more like a spectrum. And I think actually we kind of like wave our hands at that possibility at some point in the paper where we talk about there's certain structures in the brain that seem in some ways to have been treated successfully in Hopfieldian terms, and yet at other times successfully in Sharingtonian terms. Okay, having said all that, without answering the question, my intuition is that you have to have some evolutionary process whereby there is a way. I remember very early on I had this debate, not with you, John, when I was talking to some people at Columbia about these issues. There has to be some way for there to be some sort of mechanism by which a Hopfieldian type system, where it's really this representational space embedded in this high-dimensional neural activity that can communicate somehow the transformations to a more Sharingtonian-like system. And the hypothesis that I came up with at the time, which is the best I'm going to be able to do right now, is that you have some sort of non-spike mediated communication where it's going to have to do with large biomolecule flows or ion flows and or subthreshold dynamics or something, where you can have a readout that does not necessarily rely on node-to-node connections in the way that the Sharingtonian does. Now, sort of launching from that kind of idea, the development, I presume I can run it the other way around. Imagine you have a Sharingtonian circuit and there's going to be some, this is a just so story for sure. There's going to be some process although I love to speculate, there's going to be some process by which you have a system that develops where it's not necessarily all about the spikes. It's not necessarily about which neuron is signaling to which other neuron. And so you're going to get some state space influence that it seems to me has to move away from that kind of organization. And I fail to see any other way to do that than to say that you need to move away from the specific signals received from specific neurons, and you kind of have this kind of causally mysterious almost. There's a beautiful phrase from the philosopher Bill Wimsatt of a causal thicket, where you have across spatiotemporal scales and such causal complexity that it's really hard to shake out in spatiotemporal terms what's influencing what. And it's going to be the development, the evolution and development of those kinds of causal thickets that's going to give rise to this kind of computation. And this is also, I'll add, why we say at the end of the paper that what an interesting, certainly speculative follow-on idea to the Hopfieldian one is that it's not just about spiking rates of neurons in your population that define the dimensionality of your space. It's all kinds of neural phenomena that might contribute to the dimensionality of the space. Okay, so that was my perhaps paltry attempt at giving a sort of speculation about how these could develop. But I don't know. What do you think?
I don't know either, but so just that was very kind of abstract. So think about, an infant developing a concept of mother, right? That's like a fundamental thing. And you emphasize that a representation in your terms, in Hopfield terms, has to be detachable, right, from the perceptual sensory stimulus. It seems like that's kind of a developmental process in the formation of a concept, that initially the stimulus has to be there, and then I start, being able to think of my mother without my mother having to be there in any sensory sense. And I'm not sure that you can cleave representations in the way that you have as either detachable or not detachable. It just seems like not a binary thing.
Right. So the first sense of my question just had to do with the relationship between Sharingtonian circuits and Hopfieldian circuits. This question about representation, I actually think would apply whether you're a Sharingtonian or a Hopfieldian. So I think that these properties of representation, notably, we mentioned detachability in the paper, are on the one hand, I take them to be features of the system that need to be explained regardless of which camp one affiliates with.
I don't fully agree. I think what is true, we've had conversations on here, is the Gricean non-natural semantic representation argument and how we get those. How do one get arbitrary detached? How did Stephen Hawking, who could not move, think about black holes? And what part of his brain was he using when he thought about black holes? I can assure you he wasn't using his spinal cord or his brainstem. Okay, so all I'm saying is that our guess, which is a complete hedge, is that this vexed question of detached, Gricean, unnatural semantic representations, if we're going to ground it in neuroscience, is going to come out of Hopfieldian characterizations of cortex. Okay, and that's just a guess, that that's the best chance we have of a wedding between this very vexed issue of arbitrary representations and a neuroscience of them is going to be a Hopfieldian story. You're not going to get your spinal cord to think about black holes, right? So I don't think
is that a novel perspective?
Yeah, right. So I'm just saying that there's a Sharingtonian axis, and then it hits sort of somewhere in the brainstem and cerebellum and basal ganglia, and then we're in a new regime, and that new regime is probably going to be Hopfieldian.
Yeah, but even if you were a diehard Sharingtonian, I think you would need to account for these properties of representations. I think that's just one of the things that you'll need to explain if you want to explain cognition and you're committed to the Sharingtonian view. I don't know how you would go about doing it, which is why we are of the opinion that your best bet is going to be the Hopfieldian one. But I'll add that all of that having been said, it still doesn't really address the central question, which is how do these representations develop? How do you get a detachable representation, for example, or one of the other properties that we mentioned of representations? And I think that's a really good question. And it might be the case that for some ecologically salient representations that are super important, maybe it is that the system is born with them in some sense, that you can have, it's just wired up such that you can have a token representation. You can have, in other words, an instance of a representation in the brain that is detachable. But for something like airplane, which I don't think we are born with, although there are philosophers who have said we're born with the full complement of concepts, which I think is crazy. That's Jared Fodor. I think it is going to be the case that there is going to be some developmental stage whereby you do have the development of the ability to think about things even when they're not in your sensory manifold, even when they're not presented to you. And if we're Hopfieldian about it, that's going to end up being the formation of a state space as a result maybe of learning, pruning, representation, and reinforcement of connections between different systems, different connections, because the connections are only second level explainers anyways. And then that's how you're going to get the development of these kinds of representations. But I think it's an interesting and very much open question.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. So I'm going to now invite.
Oh, bye. Thank you for your question.
Thanks for joining, Ben. It's great seeing you.
Yeah, now we know we need to, unfortunately, we can't keep people, so we have to kick some people off screen to bring others. It's always more fun when more people can join. So I have to say, and this is not a question, but I think more concise and more clear answers with very specific claims would be a lot more helpful in general, if that's like an option. Because I think long-winded answers with a lot of analogies, I understand that there is a kind of a disciplinary difference. In philosophy, they're more common, but I think some of the answers, some of the questions can have concise answers, and more I guess more clear-cut sort of expression of positions would be very helpful in people being able to engage from, especially those who are neuroscientists or computer scientists. Hi, so glad to have two fantastic philosophers on screen. Very fortunate. Rosa, go ahead.
Yeah, so I guess I just wanted to ask the second part of the question. So, reading the paper and listening to your talk, I'm still trying to figure out exactly what the difference is supposed to be between the Sharingtonian and Hopfieldian approaches. So one difference, which you say is not the key difference in the paper, is the difference between population versus single neurons. The other one that seemed like it was coming at is something like a difference between a representational level description or explanation versus something that's merely causal, where it seems like the best that the Sharingtonian can do is give a purely causal characterization of the system. But what more to it is there? Well, I guess first, are those two the right dimensions of variation? And then what else is there if they're not?
So there are differences at both the algorithmic and the implementational level. At the algorithmic level, the Sharingtonian conceptualizes cognition as a result of a system that can be described as sets of connections between nodes. That is not how the Hopfieldian characterizes it. Instead, the Hopfieldian characterizes the system as representational spaces, dimensions of semantic variation, and transformation between those spaces or movement within them. It's a very sort of Churchlandian.
It's essential to the Hopfieldian that it's semantic spaces.
We characterize them as representational spaces. We don't consider, although I guess of course it's a conceptual possibility that you could have some abstract non-semantic dimension, space of variations. I suppose that's conceptually coherent, yeah. It's a very Churchlandian kind of understanding of state space semantics, but instead kind of for computation.
I mean, I think this was really Masvida's question, but it's like surprising that you make representation play such a strong role in that characterization, given that Churchland and Shenoy are, go out of their way to say these aren't representations; they're doing something other than representing.
Right. So the Churchland I was talking about was Paul Churchland, not Mark, which maybe helps clarify that a little bit, but maybe not. And so the difference would be that there is a view of sort of the state space approach to understanding what the system is doing, where the spaces are representational spaces. And that's some work that was in the philosophy of mind that was described and characterized, a position that was described and characterized by Paul Churchland in a series of papers in the mid-1980s. And then that kind of approach has been applied to movement planning, which is really John's forte. So I don't want to the expert is sort of here, so I'll let him handle that. But what I was just referring to was that older philosophy of mind work. That's at the algorithmic level. At the implementational level, the Sharingtonian is really concerned with the specific description of how neurons are wired together, whereas the Hopfieldian is less concerned with, or alternatively, as a monkey physiologist, you might think I'm actually Sharingtonian because I'm very concerned with spikes and spike counts and interspike intervals, and other types of characteristics of my spike trains. But the Hopfieldian is less concerned with those kinds of details, more concerned with mass measures of neural activity, multi-single unit recordings, and looking at where each sort of dimension of variation in your high dimensional space could be conceptualized as a neuron, and the variability along that dimension is the neuron's firing rate, but it could be other aspects of neural activity. It could be local field potentials. It could be other aspects.
The representational thing isn't essential to the Hopfieldian? They don't have to be representational spaces?
So for cognition, they do. But for me, it seems like you could have a Hopfieldian who's addressing other questions about the system that aren't necessarily related to cognition.
I think it's a very important point, Rosa. I mean, you're absolutely correct that the Mark Churchland and Krishna, when they started using these dynamical system analysis at the population level for motor cortex and dorsal premotor cortex, it absolutely was non-representational. And I think they're right that it's non-representational. Just like I think a CPG in the spinal cord, right, going back to Sten Grillner's work, which is also an emergent property of lots of neurons connected together, right, isn't representational. So in other words, I think it's really important that you can have population level occurrences like central pattern generators and motor cortex, which are non-representational. The point, and I think is very important, is that if you believe that cognition requires representation of a particular kind, and we do, then we're saying the best bet to get that kind of representation is at a population level phenomena. So yes, representation will need a population level account, but not all population level phenomena are representational and cognitive.
They're not yet. It's non-cognitive. That's exactly right.
Thanks. I just want to, before Mazvita asks the question, no more white man Namian. Please just explain things. We have now Hopfieldian, Churchlandian, Sharingtonian. No more, please. Let's just stick to the perspectives. Especially since Mark Churchland is not here, Hopfield is not here, Sherrington is not here. Let's just like stick to that. I think for me, it becomes at some point like a little confusing.
Yeah, I think it's extra confusing because it's not like this is like an exhaustive characterization of the possibility space, right? Like they seem like 2 points, but maybe no one is a full sharing whatever in your sense or a full Hopfieldian in your sense. It seems like what you really care about is capturing the right level of abstraction for describing the phenomena that you're interested in, and also the right, I don't know, taxonomy of explanation, right? Like whether you want it to be representational versus implementation level.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think there are people, even the same scientists will use, one set of methods, and then in the very next day use another set of methods, or have these composite kinds of explanations and so on and so forth. So I think that's exactly right.
Just one thing, Rosa, though, is that it's not just an epistemological choice, an epistemological exercise. The idea here is that what's being generated, whether it's in a central pattern generator or an M1 or elsewhere, is an ontologically real aggregate object. It's not just that's what we've chosen to do epistemologically. These objects that are generated in the Hopfieldian view are just as real and absolutely real as a neuron is. Okay, so it's not
why is that so important to emphasize? I feel like you're taking on these like really heavyweight ontological commitments, and you don't have to.
Well, I don't think that's true, because I think the nervous system has to use them. It's not just us as third-person scientists looking in and deciding how to analyze our data. We're talking about, does the nervous system use a derived aggregate object as its primary thing to play with computationally or not? And I'm saying
isn't
yes.
That kind of hard to probe whether it's actually using it? We want to know whether it's causally important in the process, right?
but
Whether
we
Yeah, we
manipulating.
can perturb it. I don't think certainly in the paper, we don't make that ontological argument. And I had to push back against John for making that ontological argument because it's a really hard argument to make. I mean, you start bringing on a lot of questions about the relationship between the data analysis methods and whether or not they're really revealing something real. What does it mean for something to be real in your brain, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of, it's a heavy metaphysical push but I actually agree, I think, with John. I think that these are real things in the brain that we're uncovering. I don't know if the phrase ended up staying in the final article. At one point, we were calling this a cognitive neuroontology, and we got kind of savaged in review for that phrase because it was really loaded phrase. I really like that phrase, but it was a really loaded phrase. But I do think these are real things in the brain. But what does it mean for somebody to be real? I mean, we can perturb them, we can intervene on them, we can do various things that will show that they play a role in the production of behavior. Is that good enough for making these strong metaphysical claims? Typically,
It's
no.
good enough for me.
It's good enough for me, but if you're a real strong empiricist, that's not going to be good enough. And so it's
Sorry, it seems good enough for science, and it seems like that's all you really want. I don't know why you would want to make these stronger metaphysical claims.
I'm a philosopher every other day, so maybe
we do
it's
make
because
strong metaphysical claims, Rosa, for neurons.
I'm not sure what we're talking about.
I mean, we do believe they're real objects that
absolutely.
right? So why are neurons allowed to be given that status and these derived population level objects not?
Well, I don't want to get too far off topic, but I think there are reasonable considerations for when you want to say things are real, like they're visible from many different perspectives. There are things that you can see under a microscope. They're not just characterized functionally, so on. But I feel like this is moving away from the topic.
No, I just want to add to what Rosa was saying, something even more. If you are talking to neuroscientists, if the paper is published in a neuroscience venue, the ontological status, the philosophical ontological status, I agree with Rosa that commitment is not sort of pertinent to what one finds necessarily. The same way that whether you think numbers are, whatever your philosophy of mathematic position is about the metaphysics of numbers, you can still be a mathematician and do your equations without thinking about that. So I think that I agree with Rosa that these are separate things. Like we don't need that claim. We don't need strong ontological claims or otherwise about representations or whatnot in order to make claims that make sense about the relationship between neurons, neural populations, and representations. One can still make those claims without it. Nobody's going to think that it's, dualism. But I just want to say, Hopfield's 1982 model was based on the Ising models, 1974. And it's all about, content addressable associative memory systems with binary threshold nodes, which is why, and all of it realized in neural networks, which is why I'm still confused about sort of claims about semantics or other things, because it's at the end of the day, the point is that it's still a series of nodes and their connections and the dynamics that happens between them. And in fact, some of these emergent sort of embodied folks, they use dynamical systems to argue against even representationalism. So I'm a little lost whether this is about the dynamic systems thing, whether it's about a philosophical perspective on the ontology of some kind of representations. And I see Masvita not, so I'm going to move to her because we haven't heard from Masvita yet. But yeah, Rosa, please stay on. This is a discussion, of course.
Sure. Yeah, can you hear me? Hi. Yeah, thanks for the paper. It's really interesting. Like lots of people, I was just scratching my head thinking about what this distinction is. And so I can tell you what I came up with or what I think you should have said, and you can tell me why it's wrong. So I think this is about the most venerable distinction in the philosophy of biology, which is between reductionists and holists. And I think the Sharingtonian view is really what Barlow said in 1972, the neuron doctrine for perception. I don't think it's this simplistic neuron doctrine. I think what he said was like neuron doctrine plus. The key assumption there was that the working parts of the nervous system were neurons, and the key thing about them was that they had fixed response properties. So it wasn't like all of cognition is being done by like individual neurons, but it's about the decomposability of the system, because the response profiles of neurons in the visual system are fixed, it means you can just look at them one by one, piecemeal, doing single neuron physiology, and then you can work out how the whole system works by just putting all that knowledge together. And he explicitly says in that paper, like, what we know about the nervous system now, it allows us to forget about worries about holism and radical context dependency of response profiles, and this idea that the brain is doing something holographic and weird and like impossible to decompose at the single neuron level. But it seems like now, with all the population physiology that's coming out, there's a lot more worries about context dependency and multiplexing, and that's pushing people, the pendulum swinging back towards that holist direction, which is what you call the Hopfieldian one.
I think that's a nice way of understanding the distinction, actually. I think I endorse it. I will say the context dependency I'm a little less clear on, because as a single unit physiologist, you'll definitely see neurons take on firing rates for different task conditions in different contexts. In one block, you'll see one firing rate. You'll see the same firing rate in a different block, and it has different effect on the system. So there is some context dependency even in the single units.
Sure.
And so, but I didn't take you to be wedded to that claim in your anyway.
So I was saying, yeah, sure, there's context dependency with the single units, but you know, in that Barlow picture, he's saying to a good approximation, what's going on is that single units are fixed filters, so you don't need to worry about drift too much. He thinks the evidence is just more weighing towards fixed filters, and I think that's a key assumption underlying his neuron doctrine. And it's interesting, when I talked to Mark Churchland about why he called his view of the motor cortex the non-representational one, he said, well, it's because the physiology of motor cortex is so different from visual cortex in that, you know, the neurons are drifting around so much in their response profiles. So for him, calling it representational was about referring to the stability of the response properties, that you could just say there is something in the world that it's representing because it keeps making the same response again and again. So yeah,
the fixity of the response or the stability of the response, I think, is a key difference. I agree with that, absolutely. And I think, you know, I guess our hypothesis here is that insofar as there is this representational significance for cognitive functions in the brain, it's going to come about that requires this kind of fixity. It's not going to be these single units. It's not going to be the connections.
It's going to be at the population.
And yeah, that's right. Or even, I like to think it's even beyond that, because I don't even think it's necessarily the neurons themselves that are going to matter, but ultimately, and certainly not at the algorithmic level.
And also, just because, you know, with Rosa and Mazita both here, you know, as you now know, Mark is now looking at SMA. Okay. And here he has to say it's representational, and he does. Because when you get to SMA, what he finds is that you're actually representing the order of the actions generated by the monkey. Right? And so
you're planning, you've got planning. Sorry.
In the planning sense, right?
Yes.
So you're basically
you're cognitive.
With the same analysis, to Rosa's point, you have a non-representational CPG-like population consequence, and then you go into SMA and apply the same analysis, and it's representational and cognitive, which he explicitly calls it, by the way, right? So in other words, you can have a cognitive version of the same analysis and a non-cognitive version, right? And that is actually quite inspiring, because it sort of makes the case that if you're going to talk about a representation, albeit in this case it's just the order of what you're planning to do, it's coming out at the level of the population, right? And it's not so easy, although there are single units that have some of those features, right? So it's exactly right. It's when do you have, what's the best bet for when you're going to get this representation which gets the, you know, called, cognitive, versus just next door in M1, you don't see it, right? It's just the actual muscle activations.
Okay, but there it sounds like what's pushing the idea that it's cognitive is that it's to do with planning, which is this offline thing. You're like away from the interface with the world, and you're like drawing on some internal model.
Representation, right. Exactly.
So
Can I jump in here for a second? So you made a big deal about how representations have to be detachable or they don't count, but this doesn't seem quite like it's detachable in the same way, because it seems like you're evaluating it by a different standard, right? Like for motor representation to be detachable, it's not that it should be the same even when the sensory stimulation is different. It's that it should be the same even if you're not going to produce the movement, right? Even if you're just considering.
Right. So we use detachability to illustrate some of these more complicated properties relative to the way that the term representation is used in sensory motor neuroscience. But we do say in the article, and we're careful to note that the actual sort of more sophisticated properties that you need are going to be determined by the cognitive function that you're trying to explain. So you have a computational model. That model might require sort of offline planning or something like that. Then you might need detachability. But it's possible that there will be other models that require other properties, and in particular don't require detachability. They might just require some sort of flexibility. They might require, there's other ways to think about representation that still go beyond this relatively bland, very general sensory motor sense. And that's what we were trying to establish.
So the SMA activations that are supposed to be, that are motor representational, do we have evidence that they're detachable?
Right. I mean, I don't think that there's been a go, no go version. I'd have to ask whether you can see it. But I mean, you could imagine if the order is something that the monkey knows, it would be a little bit like, do all of us right now, before we go to the ATM, have our ATM numbers in our heads, right? It would seem to me very strange to say that it's not until we're in front of the ATM machine that then only when we're about to move does the ATM number emerge in our SMA.
It's not even clear,
I mean,
by the way.
I would say that it's like dispositional until it's actually triggered, and it's only occurrent when you're in front of the ATM. Like that
might be true, but I'm not even sure that counts as detachability. So there's sort of
that doesn't sound detachable. I agree.
That's right. Yeah, I agree with that. And just because it's detachable, so there's kind of two senses of detachability as well, right? There's sort of stimulus-bound detachability. But you might have a stimulus like an ATM machine that's presented to you at time A, and then at time B, that machine is no longer present before you, but there is a causal chain that gives rise to that representation. That also doesn't count as detachability in my mind. Detachability really refers to not just a stimulus bound or not stimulus bound. There is a break in the causal chain between what the representation, the content of the representation, and the occurrence of the representation in the mind. And it's not obvious that you'll get that stronger sense of detachability in this case. So I agree with you. Yeah.
And I would agree that an overlearned ATM number is a disposition. Yes.
This has been awesome. We actually seem to be agreeing on a lot of stuff at the end of the day.
That's not what I see. I don't know. We might be seeing a difference a lot.
This could be a difference in discipline as well. Usually philosophy is just cantankerous and disagreements all around.
I was educated in philosophy too, but yeah, I don't know. That's not
so basically Barlow is fine to classify as the Sharingtonian view.
There's a wonderful paper that does that. There's other,
Wait, can I hear, Masvita, do you want to finish that? I want to hear more.
I was just going to say, just as a historical point, I mean, he was certainly influenced by Sharrington's physiology and certainly the reductionist assumptions about both methodology and ontology are there in the reflex theory of Sharrington. But then he has all this stuff about integration, which is more complicated than that.
So would you think that? So would you not consider the Hopfieldian view reductionist?
It seems quite anti-reductionist, and I mean the key anti-reductionist claim and what is there underwriting this idea that you should give ontological status to something which is above the neuron level seems to be because whatever that is above the neuron level is determining the activities that are there at the neuronal level.
So the idea that there is an emergent sort of representation from so that's the sort of common perspective in neuroscience, as far as I know. I don't know many neuroscientists that don't have that perspective. So, but I still think there are neuroscientists with that view that can be reductionist, and so I don't think it's quite anti-reductionist. But it's great to hear your perspective on it. So it seems like from your perspective, the distinction is between reductionism and anti-reductionism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so just as Barlow stated the view, it was very clearly reductionist through and through, and maybe that got diluted through time as people like realized that there are all of these actual experimental phenomena that didn't fit with that extreme clear-cut reductionist picture, and so they drifted towards more accepting emergentism. But yeah, and we're in this transition right now where the non-reductionist view needs like a clearer articulation.
So Tim Behrens asks what ontological means. So maybe Masvita, I want to clarify because I think Tim is.
Well,
yeah.
It's a theory of the being of beings.
Go figure that, Tim.
Well,
I'm sure that was very helpful to you, Tim.
Well, it's used just in this context. It's to do with is it something that's actually real in the world? In other words, it's about something that is being in the world versus epistemology, which is what we may have knowledge about the world through, and perhaps what we have knowledge about the world through isn't actually real, right? So it's the difference between whether you think this is what the world is really like, or we only have access to it the way we can think about it. And you might be doing that with fictions. Basically.
I want to offer a middle interpretation where ontology could also just refer to the set of basic things that occur in your explanations, and you don't make any robust metaphysical commitments. Instead, you can just say, I have this collection of atoms, so to speak, in my metaphysical set, but I'm not making a claim that that set corresponds to the real world in any way, but it's the elements in that set that I'm going to pull from in constructing my explanations. And I think that's
like scientific taxonomy.
Sure, that's right.
What it sounds
any
like.
more heavyweight than that?
Well, I think John was making the case that
right.
it is more heavyweight, but what I'm saying is it's just a scientific taxonomy ontology. Yeah,
they're not the same, I think.
Not
Ontology.
Yeah,
exactly.
I mean, it just comes down to, this is so fascinating. Is there really only one discipline, physics, and everything else is really just our epistemological failure? And so we have to have economics and sociology and mathematics and biology, and they're not really. In the end, it will all be physics, and it's just our epistemological failure. Or are these, like Strevens has talked about, these disciplines pointing to real different objects with which to work with that have been created? And I tend towards the fact that I think that a parliament or a party is a real thing, just like the individuals that make it up are real. And it's a hairy issue.
but
So for those who might not,
go ahead.
was that a direct follow-up? Okay. So for those who might not be familiar with some works, I think it was, I don't know if it was in the 80s or earlier, there was different sort of levels of sciences and relating to reductionism. And one idea was, can you reduce the notion of money to just physics? Can you explain money with the level of the science of physics? And we can't, because there could be a lot of interactions that require us to create entities that are functioning at the economics level. And you cannot have types in physics. So there can't be a type identity between notions of money, between notions of money institutions, financial institutions, and some entities in physics. You could produce a set of things that are the materials of money so far in the world, but that wouldn't account for varieties of money that will come up in the future functionally, like Bitcoin or credit cards, etc., that didn't exist, for instance, in the 50s. So the notion of money goes beyond just specifying if somebody was Leibniz's demon and had all of the potential material that has ever been used by money, that would still not capture how money functions, for instance. It needs laws and sort of interactions at another level. And for those of you who work with neural networks, you probably know that at some point we are working with some things that in some neural networks, not in all of them, some explanations that are at a level that is no longer just at the level of individual neurons. And so, for instance, some dynamical system might be created, and these things have existed since the 70s, of course, Ising models and others that Hopfield followed up on. And those of you who actually code and do neural networks, I recommend to go and try out an Ising model or a simple Hopfield model after this. If you Google it, you'll probably find, if you're doing Python or MATLAB, and take a look at it for those of you who have the code, because I think that a lot of the ways that people are talking here about things might be a little further away, a couple of steps further away from what actually happens there. But it's also wonderful to see how that kind of a beautiful, simple thing that happens with your mathematical equations for your neural networks, how it can give rise to conversations that people are having right now, which relates to, again, the non-reducibility of money, for instance, to physics, and therefore perhaps non-reducibility of some mental states to physics, in spite of the fact that we just modeled them with a simple neural network. I think that that's a nice little experiment that both it can be coded and thought. And I'm thinking it would be fun to have like a session where someone like Rosa is joined with someone like me who brings a Jupyter notebook. And then we try to sort of engage people to build that thing, but also think about it in those ways. I really appreciate the way that Rosa made these distinctions. I think we can maybe bring Tim at this point, because Tim had some very interesting thoughts, but also John Flowers had some interesting points. I think they're both probably still here, and they were on our list. I want to keep Rosa on screen, so Jova, can you choose one of them? I guess
I invited Flowers.
Go ahead. Okay.
Like we said earlier, we were going to bring him on, and Tim said he would go last. So
okay, that's right. Yeah, another philosopher. We have a lot of philosophers today. Hi.
Yeah. Nice to see you. You're muted.
Oh, did you want me to ask my question?
Just say whatever.
Oh, okay, so a couple of questions come to mind, right? So at the most broadly philosophical, I have to ask, what do you mean by objects of cognition or cognitive activity? Because it becomes fairly abstract in some places, right? So one might say, is the experience of love a cognitive activity? And insofar as it is, how does your model, say, account for it, right? And so when we're thinking which gets to a whole bunch of other questions, right? So if I understand the thrust of your project, you're looking for the simplest ontological object for neuroscience to provide two understandings of the mind, yes? Okay, so wouldn't the simplest ontological object depend on, say, the conception of mind you're starting out with from the first place, or in the first place, right? So insofar as you may be treating either neurons or other objects that you hypothesize as the simplest ontological object, that has to correspond with your broader view, your broader understanding of mind. So for example, if you were to operate on a Deweyan perspective, the neuron might not be the best place to start, right? It might be part of the overall organism and so on and so forth, but that would really depend on what you're trying to do. So my question is, a long way around, what's the concept of mind you're working with that allows for, say, the simplest ontological object you're proposing to contribute to a theory of mind?
So, the characterization, and stop me if I'm wrong, or correct me if I'm wrong, the characterization of cognition as the transformation of representations is not sufficient to answer that question, right?
Yeah, because then you'd have to account for, say, the activity of cognition in affective experiences vis-a-vis your structures of representation and so on and so forth, which is, I mean, it's kind of a trite challenge that comes up every so often when people start thinking through neuroscience with regards to our ongoing experience in the world. But I do think it's something we need to take seriously if we're going to talk about cognition robustly.
So there's going to be, so I think you brought up the experience of love. Other kinds of emotions might provide challenges. Do they have objects? I think would be one of the major questions. Generalized fear, dread, or anxiety are oftentimes mentioned in the same sort of skeptical kind of context. I don't have a good response off the top for those kinds of challenges to this general approach. We adopted that definition of cognition because it was largely inspired by the computational theory of mind and how the computational theory of mind has been embodied in certain research programs in cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience, where there is a conceptualization of cognitive function as the result of internal transformations of representations in the brain. I think there's going to be, this came up a little bit earlier also with regards to inactivism and those kinds of processes. And my response to that was, I think insofar as there is sort of good scientific work being done, it'll have to be accommodated within the representation and transformation framework. When we start talking about certain putative mental states that don't necessarily have cognitive objects, like experiences of love or ecstasy, experiences of fear, experiences of dread, generalized anxiety, and so forth, those are, I actually think those are severe challenges. So even though in the paper, we really presupposed, we didn't even argue for it, we just said, this is how we're going to think of cognition. Those are fundamental challenges to the theory of cognition that strike me as actually really good ones. And for me, those are the reasons. Also, there's a whole subset of properties of the mind having to do with consciousness, and qualitative features of consciousness. And I'm a strong believer in subjective properties of experience, also called qualia. And so I don't think that those necessarily are going to be handled on a representational theory of mind either. And so I think these are the really good reasons to keep an open mind about what cognition is. Having said that, I'm hopeful that, and I wouldn't want the interpretation of the neuroscience to fall to some of these conceptual concerns. So however we would accommodate some of these challenging cases like the redness of red or the experience of red, and cases like non-specific love or divine rapture, these are real properties, in some cases non-representational because they're experiential, in other cases non-representational because it doesn't look like there's an object that they're about, that I think would need to be accommodated in the successor paradigm. It's unclear even what scientific construct these would apply to. Conceptual framework, we start to get very Carnapian here about when we're thinking about these kinds of issues. So I see these as real challenges, but I see them as challenges that, fingers crossed, would be amenable to combination with either the Sharingtonian or the Hopfieldian view, whichever way that neuroscientists go about their business. I wouldn't want to litigate from the outset through the use of concepts whether or not certain explanations are permitted or not. I kind of, the way I do philosophy of neuroscience is I let the neuroscientists lead, and then I try and, this is an old-fashioned way maybe of doing it, I try and think of how to rationally reconstruct what they're doing in a fashion that gives it the best epistemological and metaphysical foundations possible.
In the spirit of Ida's short answer thing, yeah. I think that you're absolutely right, Jonathan, that that something like pain or love probably shouldn't be subjected to the computation over representation treatment. And as you know, Tononi, Koch, and others think that consciousness should be considered much more like pain rather than a cognitive computation. And then, the final point is will having love and pain and emotion fundamentally interact with cognition in a way that makes this artificial parceling off of cognition wrong? It very well could be.
So there is one last thing that I wanted to throw out here, particularly with regards to the broader commentary about embodied and enacted cognition. So my question here is, isn't this model based first primarily on humans and then second primarily upon entities that share a embodiment like humans, right? So my question is, insofar as we're talking about insofar as we're looking at, cognition of organisms, would you apply this to, say, a cat or a fish, so on and so forth, right? So even within the realm of humans, given the example of Stephen Hawking, does this apply to broadly neurodiverse individuals, right? So are you presuming a kind of standardized organization of our biophysicality here when building up this model?
And the model here is sort of conceptualizing cognition as transformation over representations, or did you have
Conceptualizing cognition as transformation over representations, because you seem strongly, like, as a philosopher of neuroscience, you seem strongly wedded to the existing neuroscientific understanding of the human brain, the human mind, so on and so forth. And yet one of the things that increasingly we're thinking about is that we cannot generally say that all minds function the same way, even among the human mind.
Can I just, for clarification, are you suggesting that the notion of mind might be more embodied, as in depending on the kind of species that's carrying it? Is that the direction you're going?
Yeah, depending on the kind of species, depending on the kind of organization of their neurological physicality, right? Again, the Stephen Hawking example, which is kind of helpful insofar as Stephen Hawking's, organization of his body is fundamentally different, right? In some very important ways. And so that's kind of what I'm pushing at.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd go even further. I'd say conceivably some networks of mushrooms do something that looks like cognition sometimes, but we can't identify any individual member of that species that has the mind. It's just so it's a different kind of notion, and there are different ways of embodying the notion of mind that we might not have the right sort of explanation for. Yeah, thanks for that clarification.
Jonathan, it's a little bit like, that picture I'm sure you've seen in Dan Dennett's latest book, where he shows two structures, Gaudi's Sagrada Familia and a ant mound that looks surprisingly like the Sagrada Familia, right? And Dennett makes the point that it is, even if they were identical, the intentionality of the architect and the group hive mind that produced it, one had a representation, the other did not, right? One had intentionality. So in other words, you can have the same net result. And, as to Stephen Hawking, there's that amazing book, right? The Diving Bell and the Butterfly by Dominique Bauby, who was completely paralyzed, right? All he could do was just do some vertical eye movements, and that was it. And yet wrote a whole book, right? And that whole book was highly understandable by all of us. So in other words, whatever representations he was using to write that book were entirely intact in the absence of any sensory motor dysfunction at all, minus some very minor vertical eye movements. So something survives invariantly at the level of cognition, despite the loss of the sensory motor system.
And I would say the framework is pretty flexible. So I certainly we didn't mean to imply that everyone has to have the same body image or body schema or anything like that. So, cognition in animals across the variety of animals is definitely okay. A lot of the work we cite, the two studies I cited in the brief talk at the start, for example, those were all both done in non-human primates. I personally work with non-human primates. They're extremely cognitively sophisticated. I had this more fantastical interpretation of what you're saying, which had to do with suppose aliens came to this planet and they just had nothing even remotely like what we have been discussing. And I think that's also possible and would serve as kind of like a counterexample. So one way to conceptualize the proposal is to think of this as sort of terrestrial cognition and to put some explicit scope bounds on the claims and on the conceptualization. So that's how I would reply to that, in the spirit of being concise, which I've been failing to do.
Well, Tim just announced he's quite drunk, so I'm inviting him on now. We'll see how that goes. If not, I don't know if Jess is still here, but I'd love to hear what she has to say also.
Tim is going to talk to us about love in neural networks.
No, I don't want to shut love. I want to play a game of sharing. I want to play a game.
Wait, you said that in the chat. I thought you were going to follow up on what you said in the chat.
No. I think it's a serious point that not all that I know that John wants me to deny the existence of connections in the brain, but many parts of the brain are trying to interpret the activity of other brain areas via those connections. And so some of the representations in the brain will be the representations of what's happening in other brain areas. And so I think the idea that you might completely dismiss that there could be representation of love or pain is silly, really. But that wasn't what I wanted to ask. I also want to support what John and I mean, I feel slightly. I concede that I reviewed this paper, and therefore I've had an opportunity already to ask John and David a lot of questions about it, and so therefore I feel slightly weird asking them again in public, but there we go. I think maybe firstly I want to say most of it of what John and David's saying is clearly interesting and true. And this Gaudi versus anthill thing, I think, is an example of how interesting and true it is. It's almost like Gaudi has inside his brain a grammar with which he can construct those things, and all of the spires are the same, and he likes the symmetry of them, etc. And the anthill stuff, which is just built out of stochastic, like emergent processes, it sort of looks the same, but doesn't have that kind of symmetry or regularity, which makes the one of them artistic and the other not. And I think that Standerhan has a bunch of interesting stuff on that as well. But anyway, I'll stop that. Maybe. I think we should play a yes/no game. I think that maybe all the audience apart from us is gone now, so maybe it's not useful. But just to clarify, I think we should play a yes/no game of Hopfield versus Sherrington. And so maybe I'll start with the first example. So, have I frozen? I can't. Is everyone frozen?
No. We're all here. Do you hear us?
I'm super excited about your game.
We're frozen in anticipation.
Right. Okay. So Shadlan is Sherrington, right? I think both David and John would agree, are claiming that Shadlan is Sherrington.
Are we doing this by researcher or by research products?
But the Shadlan. No. Oh, okay. The Shadlan drifting dots parietal integration is Sherrington. Well, we're going to play that game, right? So you agree with that? Yes.
Well, I actually think this is a tough one. So if you look at some of Alex Huck's papers from like the mid 2010s, he had found some evidence that what's really going on in LIP is maybe more Hopfieldian than the initial studies.
This was the example you used in your paper for Sherrington.
But it was specifically, right, but that's why I asked what the relevant target of categorization is. Is it the researcher? Is it the research program or the publication? I think different publications from even the same group will fall.
The original Reitman publication.
That is definitely Sharingtonian.
Definitely Sharingtonian.
Okay.
Definitely. Although there's been some slippage, right? In other words, Bill Newsom has done much more Hopfieldian-like work now on the same kind of idea. And I think, I'm not sure how much Mike likes it or not, but there has been a move, as you know.
Okay, so that original paper of drift diffusion model that everyone probably knows in the audience is Sharingtonian. What if I multiply the population activity by a random rotation, literally just multiply it by a matrix, so that it's now in a space? Is it now Sharingtonian or is it Hopfieldian?
Well, okay, so this brings up a good point, which is that the Hopfieldian framework is flexible enough, and we say this in the paper, that it can handle and describe the Sharingtonian framework, but the reverse is not true. So what you've done is you've applied a Hopfieldian transform to a Sharingtonian network. Sure, it's Hopfieldian. The Sharingtonian cases, so maybe this is where the gotcha is, which is we said that the Reitman example is Sharingtonian. It's also Hopfieldian.
Gotcha. Okay, excellent. So now, so Sheldon is no longer just Sharingtonian. That's a good start. Next question. So the Sheldon example is an interesting Hopfieldian example because this neurons align with the axes of the space, right? That's great. Is that useful information or not to you? Is it useful to you in the Hopfieldian world that the neurons align with the axis of the space?
I mean, because then you can make the case that the reflex arc is it's Hopfieldian. It's just that the neurons align with the dimensions of variation, which I think may in fact be a great way to even quantify the evolutionary trajectory. So the more you deviate, the more the neuron's dimensions deviate from the relevant dimensions of variation in the space, the more Hopfieldian it is, or something like that. So yes, I agree with all that.
So I see. So you think it is a relevant factor? I was expecting you to say no to this question, so I'm now slightly stuck. But you think it is a relevant factor that the neurons align? So that now that is taking me back to you think that Sharingtonian's interesting. Okay, perfect. Next question then. Let's say the motor activity in SMA that you were talking about. Let's say those different representations of the future, which clearly are representations. I totally agree with you, because they're divorced from where you are now. They can become abstracted. Let's say they were pools of individual neurons, one for action A, one for action B, one for action C, and there was no requirement for PCA. Is that Hopfieldian, or is that Sharingtonian?
If that were true, it would be Sharingtonian.
Are you sure? Because I'm not sure that the specific connections. I'm not sure the specific connections matter. I'm not entirely.
Yeah, but he's talking about tuning. He's including tuning.
Are you including tuning? He's including tuning. Tim, are you including tuning?
That's where I'm trying to really define the difference here.
Yeah, no. So let's answer it, right? So in other words, I think that if you were to say that, and we say this, that if you had tuned neurons, which was the whole beginning of Mark and Krishna's project, right? Which was, do you need to have tuned neurons? And then, of course, the mixed selectivity and Stefano and other people's work. If tuning was really the fundamental property, and all you did by summing over the population was just to increase signal to noise, that would be Sharingtonian. The question is can you have an emergent property that isn't present in any cluster or tuning of neurons and has to actually be derived at the aggregate level? That would be Hopfieldian.
I think it does depend on some of the details of the case here. So if you're able to get sharpened tuning from random connectivity or something like this, then it starts to look a little more Hopfieldian. You know, I said earlier that it's not a case of a hard boundary between these views. There's kind of like
so now we're getting to some quite good predictions, right? So now let's say I plot all the activities for action A and action B, right? And so now I think this is like a realistic proposition. I plot all the activities for action A and action B, and they're not Gaussian. There's some overlap, but they've got fat tails. Some neurons just like action A, some neurons like action B. I think this is like a genuinely real proposition that's hidden by those representational spaces. I see it in neurons all the time. And so now I'm in a situation where it's half tuned, where the neurons really individual neurons really do carry information about those actions in SMA. I'm sure they do, or in PFC. But also you can get more information if you take the axis. What is that?
Well, I think
that's halfway between the game.
Yeah, so I think it depends. This is where I would bring in the first level, second level explainer. So the question is, what is the explanation? Is the explanation truly advert to this mixed selectivity that you're describing, or does the explanation actually turn on this space, representational space, and the trajectories through that space? And I think it's the case that I would say for SMA that you're going to see trajectories and you're going to see this kind of representational Hopfieldian type explanation, in which case this mixture of preferences in the neurons, and they like a little bit of B, a little bit of A, that may be how you explain the presence of that space, but it isn't in the first instance an explanation of the cognitive activity itself.
And we never objected to that, right? In other words, if those fat tails, which are slightly preferential for A and B, end up being the basis for the second level explanation of this trajectory, well, in a way that has to be. It's just you're not going to explain what's going in SMA by just saying, look, there's a slight difference in the fat tails. That explains what's going on in SMA. It'd be a bit weird, right? It wouldn't be giving you much intuition for discovery if you did that.
It's just, I mean, it's the same as, I mean, basic. So you have those fat tails, and now you have two options. You can say, look, there's a space that's driven by a few neurons, or you could say there's pools of neurons. and those, it seems, I don't know which is more explanatory, but one of them, I mean, I can imagine solutions with pools of neurons tuned, or I can imagine solutions with a space which happens to be driven by a few neurons. I don't know. I don't intuit one of those as more explanatory than the other. I don't know how you can say one will be more explanatory than the other of those two things. But I'm just trying to figure out what the boundaries are here at the moment. I mean, that's what I'm just maybe trying to help clarify the boundaries of the question, because I think it probably is true that when you argue it in terms of explanatory forms, it's difficult to make it concrete in various ways. And the examples are cool, but I mean, I think the complications for me with the examples are that they're all sort of linear. like there's clearly examples where PCA won't work, right? That if you're trying to argue about recursion in medial frontal cortex or theory of mind, or if you're trying to argue about what grid cells do in entorhinal cortex, then PCA won't work. I mean, they clearly won't work in entorhinal cortex because the PCA of place cells and grid cells are the same. And so given that simple linear spaces are not going to work, then in general, for cognition, maybe they'll work for some problems. Then I'm trying to work out what the more fundamental thing is than just I do a PCA, basically.
Wouldn't not to break in here, wouldn't the level of explanation and the degree to which a given observation of a phenomena is explanatory depend on the ends of the inquiry in question, right? Because you just said you wouldn't want it, or some of these things wouldn't work for PCA, right? And so I think one of the things that has been bugging me, at least since the start of the talk, is that we're distinguishing levels of explanation without looking at the ends of the inquiry itself and then organizing them hierarchically, right? Insofar as we're assuming that, there is one object of inquiry, the mind, or what have you.
That's exactly.
But we haven't defined the object of inquiry. So, like, I'm trying to figure out how we can hierarchize these without saying, well, I'm interested in this project, right? If my project requires PCA as the best possible explanation for the phenomena in question, then the other stuff will not suffice. So, and I apologize for taking us far afield. How do you justify your levels of explanation there, right?
So, Jonathan, I think you're absolutely right. I don't think you took it far afield. I think it's, there are two different arguments going on here. I mean, I think to take away what I was attacked for, the sort of ontological commitment, I think the point being made here is that if you want to understand or explain anything, you want to come up with some theoretical construct. I think to answer your question is it possible that if you do some kind of population analysis on neural data in cognitive tasks, the visualization of it, the way it looks, something about what you're looking at, instead of just the behavior, provides you some insight on how to conceptualize and theorize about it, right? And just like Feynman diagrams, we use this example in the paper, that Feynman diagrams were used to help people think. And all we're saying is, if you have a particular conception of mind, as you argue, what are we after? And we want to make some discoveries about what people do when they think. And we want to not just look at psychological behavior, we want to have a look at neural data. What's the best way to look at that neural data to have a moment of insight into what's going on during thinking?
Yeah.
Right? And that's all we're asking is what drawing, what diagram helps us make progress. Now, if looking at overlapping fat tails helps Tim make a qualitative advance in what's happening versus looking at a trajectory through a state space, then fantastic. It was the intuition, though, that the diagrams you get from the Hopfieldian approach will provide moments of insight.
But the aim of the inquiry, I think, is super important. I take that suggestion to be quite apt. And in particular, we don't deny that there are going to be aims of inquiry about the neural phenomena underlying cognition that are not going to be the first level aim. So you're going to say, okay, let's suppose that it is this kind of state space computation that's occurring in this brain area that's going to explain a given phenomenon like planning, let's say. But the fact that you find the state space can itself require explanation and be an aim of inquiry as well. And the explanation of that state space might be full-on Sharingtonian. So I don't deny that.
Okay. So gotcha. So I'm just going to follow up with some more bullying. So
wait, one second.
Tim,
yeah.
sorry.
Go on.
I want to see if I can help clarify one thing in my mind, just to put it in math terms. Like, I think what David and John might be saying is there's a difference between whether you care about the basis vectors themselves or the subspace. This is related to your question, Tim, about PCA. Like, when you do an eigendecomposition, you embed data into a subspace. You happen to get a particular set of basis vectors that one can arbitrarily rotate, and you're still in the same subspace. Or you could get a completely different subspace. And if the basis vectors correspond to the neurons, it's Sharingtonian. And if you don't really care about the particular basis, but the subspace, then you're Hopfieldian. Is that right?
that was my original question, but I think that David answered that saying that both those two things could be Hopfieldian or Sharingtonian, I think.
It depends if the neurons. It depends if the neurons align with the basis. Yeah. And that really does make a difference, in my opinion. Yeah.
So can I ask, when is this distinction helpful? So I'm trying to understand whether for doing neuroscience or whether for understanding neuroscience or for philosophy of mind, it's not clear to me, and let's focus on just doing neuroscience just to make sure that things are concise. But for doing neuroscience, when is this distinction helpful to practitioners, to people who are already practicing neuroscience?
I can just give you, I think that's a very good question. I would say that if anyone who thinks that looking at a canonical cortical circuit in its connectivity, and that somehow if you just take one of those little Lego pieces, some canonical neural circuit, and then you're just going to scale up the Lego pieces and explain cognition, that Sharingtonian conceit, I think, is unhelpful. If you believe that you're going to take a really simple circuit with identifiable neurons in an aplysia or a Drosophila, and then show a really clever, what I think, intelligent reflex, and then say that canonical circuit is going to scale up, not like a canonical cortical circuit, but we're going to scale up that Sharingtonian fundamental circuit in a Drosophila, and we're going to get what's going on in cognition in a primate, that also, I think, is unhelpful. So I think it's those cases, Ida, where people say, if you do cognition in a Drosophila, or you characterize a canonical neural circuit, that some scale up from those is going to give us cognition, that's not going to work in my view. And a lot of people are making those claims.
So would it be fair that you consider Tony Zader a Sharingtonian?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And
okay, so in that case then, John, and David, here's another question in this Hopfieldian versus Sharingtonian game. What about Jeff Hinton and the Helmholtz machine and Peter Dayan and the Helmholtz machine, where their whole purpose is to create a some latent space or some latent representation that is maybe a Hopfieldian thing, an abstraction, but to do so, they show you how all the learning has to happen through the connectome, and they understand what the abstraction is in terms of the inference on sensory properties. Is that a Hopfieldian ambition, or is that I mean, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Because you could imagine a circuit diagram doing that.
Yeah, I would actually characterize that as Sharingtonian. I would also note that is the second level explainer of cognition. The first level there is actually the state space, the Hopfieldian.
You think that's true? You genuinely think that? You think that's the first time I've genuinely disagreed with you. I genuinely think that the explainer in terms of the generative model is a better explainer, an easier thing to reason with than the mad latent variable in those models. I definitely think. Yeah,
but the explanatory target's different. The explanatory target for what you're describing is the development of the Hopfield state space.
No. Yeah, but I understand what the thing's doing from the generative. It's got a generative model. I'm inverting. I understand
what is the thing doing. What you're understanding is the result, the final result of the trained network, right? That's what you're trying to explain.
So let's say I've got a generative. So I don't know if anybody is still here apart from us. So I don't know who I'm explaining this to, but let's say
there are. Yeah, there are.
Let's say I've got a situation where I try to understand some generator of my sensory world, or some generator of my behavior, or something like that, which isn't visible in my behavior or my sensitive world or my sensory world. I can do so by layering up neurons and making an inference of a slightly more abstract things that predict what I'm going to do or see. And I have no idea how to reason with the abstractions that emerge, but I know exactly how to reason with the generative model that produced those abstractions.
Well, what is right? So what you're talking about is how can I understand the abstractions that emerge, and the way that you can understand them is by appeal to the generative model. Is that correct? Is that a
yeah?
good
I mean, I think it's I think maybe it's just who can reason best with what at this stage, right? I mean, and that generative model itself, you could imagine being instantiated in a cortical microcircuit.
Right. And so now what if I said to you, well, I want to understand how this network is able to classify these inputs into these categories. And
what if it? I see.
Okay. So there I'm focusing on this sort of concrete trained state of the network. And so in that case, you're going to say, well, it's because
I can reason about that latent space. There's about 3 latent spaces. There are about 3 or 4 latent spaces.
But at that point, you're talking about the latent
space. I can't reason about
and that's the Hopfieldian explanation.
Yeah, you're talking, but now you're talking. Now you're using the latent space.
That's right. Right. So you've actually shifted to where this is where you
just became
Hopfieldian. Tim, you just become.
No, I'm not.
Please stop talking over each other. Sorry, that's not going to work out. Like one by one, okay?
I agree with you both. I can reason about that and about 3 other latent spaces that you could imagine, but I can't reason over a latent space that tries to infer that there's a tree behind the house because I can see part of it. I can't reason over that latent space, which is the relevant one, right?
Yeah.
Why is that the relevant one? So I lost the thread there at the very end.
I can reason over a very simplistic latent space that you can draw in 2 dimensions. I can't because I can see it. I'm beginning to think that the relevant thing in Hopfieldian versus not is nothing to do with mechanism, as John says. It's to do with just literally whether you can draw the thing in 3 dimensions.
Well, this is what this is John's emphasis on the intelligibility of Hopfieldian explanations, and I'm not sure I'm on board with that.
So I can definitely reason over the latent space of classifying 2 objects from each other because it's a very easy thing to do. I definitely cannot reason over the latent space of the interesting problem, which is the latent space of what does a tree look like when it's hidden, obscured behind a house.
I see.
Or that latent space will not be something I can reason with.
But I think it will, in fact, be the explanatory object. So this may be where John and I diverge about the importance of Hopfieldian spaces as providing visualization intelligibility.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
I mean, it does come down in the end, and it's very interesting that to Ida's question, to the ontological question, to it just being an epistemological vehicle to do more discovery with, because it just seems to be easier with some things to think through the neuroscience with this way. Now, they're all maybe true, right? But I think that it's a little bit like the hedgehog and the fox, that it's a dichotomy that will actually at least give people some sense of what they're up to and the kind of work they're doing and the kind of explanations they're looking for. And I think if it's just that catalyst for a distinction, now we think it goes quite deep. I don't think we think it's just a game. You know, are you a hedgehog? Are you a fox? Are you a Sharingtonian? Are you a Hopfieldian? I think it actually does something more important than that. But I don't think that any edge cases or any blurring lessens the fact that it's quite interesting to think about these two ways to think about neuronal regimes.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I mean, I realize I've come on being very aggressive, and I didn't mean to. Because I actually totally agree with you that there's something profound about the fact that we can think about something between circuits and behavior. I mean, that's really what you're saying, is that wherever you can place things between circuits and behavior, they're real, they're not fake. And I think that is a real great offering to the way we think. And instead of thinking about PCA spaces as just dimensionality reductions, let's think about them as real objects. That I think that is fun and thought-provoking, and I agree with that. I just think that it's an opportunity to I mean, I think that the distinction is not going to be so easy as that at the end. In the end of the day, I think there's going to be real explanatory power in these more generative ways of thinking about things, for example.
Thank you, Tim. And also, I don't think you were very aggressive. I think you just expressed it in a fun way. And I think it made you, in that exercise, you made a lot of things very clear. And I think that was clever. I do think that I agree with you that there is interesting discussions that can happen. But I personally, unfortunately, think there is not sufficient clarity yet. Maybe there will be future iterations. But I think that maybe more experience, or maybe adding people who are, I don't know, more co-authors who are practitioners of each side or are holding those positions. I don't know, like, I'm not sure. It seems still, if I'm quite honest, it seems not quite baked yet. At least that's what it seems to me. And it seems, based on the confusion of so many experts in the field, it might be a similar experience for others. But I do agree that it's an interesting conversation, especially with regards to programs in neuroscience and the future of neuroscience, and what directions of the future of neuroscience would be the most sort of likely to yield novel findings. And in that regard, I think it's interesting to discuss things in general. But I do think this particular paper, I think, based on my understanding, some others had the same view. It wasn't quite there yet, but great for starting a conversation. I appreciate everyone. Just want to acknowledge some things that people put in the chat during this conversation. And I want to also acknowledge Jess's question that we promised her to ask. Jess Thompson asked, I'm curious to know whether David and John still disagree on some parts of this or not. John seems to want to privilege psychology as the sole source of explanations of cognitive phenomena. And he managed to convince David, did he manage to convince David of this? That neuroscience only contributes a confirmatory role, no theory or explanations.
My understanding, John, last time we chatted was actually that I had won. And that
you seem to have that notion here as well, which wasn't what we perceived, but okay.
I would say that I'll call it the Nivian view, that I do feel like discovery and conceptual theorizing comes more from task level analysis and behavior. And I thought that at least single neuron circuit work was mainly confirmatory. I think it is true that I'm willing to believe that there's something about the way that one draws and visualizes and analyzes population level data that one might actually have a moment of discovery, not just confirmation, and that it's more likely to come from these, neurofunctional objects. So, but I still would like there to be more evidence of a truly qualitative WTF moment where one comes up with a brand new conceptualization of a cognitive phenomena because of what the neural data said over what the task level analysis said.
I see. So
there,
you see the value of cognitive neuroscience, but you would like to see a very more clear demonstration of a case where cognitive neuro finding, and not just cognitive science or behavioral science finding, is establishing that foundation of that hypothesis.
Yes.
Okay.
That's a change.
I had that level of what the fuckery when I saw Gabor filters in the visual cortex. I had that level of, and I understood and that led me to understand a lot more about the brain's job to represent the statistics of the world. I had that level of what the fuckery when I saw grid cells, and that led me to think about how to build generative models that would represent both the world and cells. I had that level of what the fuckery when I first saw dopamine responses. I felt that taught me something deep about learning, and maybe I think that's a real case of deep history of intertwining between neurophysiology, behavior, and theory, where they have all informed each other. And I had that level, I'm ashamed to say, after some recent Twitter posts, but I think I almost had that level of what the fuckery about mirror neurons as well. I think that they, despite the fact they're universally hated by everybody apart from me, I felt there was something about an inference. I could think of generative models again that would require those representations that reduce the space of possible generative models that could account for behavior. And so I feel that there's at least 4 clear examples in recent neuroscience where genuine deep insight has emerged from looking at cell representations just off the top of my head. So I don't think it's
dopamine, grid cells, mirror neurons. What was the 4th one? Place cells?
V1 neurons. I mean, I'm sure there are others. Tim, here's another one. Here's another one that John will hate because it involves not only neural activity but also circuitry and the particular cell classes of neurons. The go-no-go pathway in the striatum gives me that level of deep insight into why some behaviors exist and others don't exist. For me personally. And I'm sure I could think of other. This is this
is very important though. To Ida's question about hypothesis, I am not denying, and none of us were denying, that there can be serendipitous bits of clue that the neural data can give. But what I would wager is that the final theoretical construct that you come up with from that trigger, that catalyst, will have been constructed out of thinking of things that came from outside of that piece of information. So in other words, the case of...
Yeah, you obviously have to know about behavior as well, but...
Right, but as I said at the very beginning of this, one has to distinguish between it being evidence that you could construct a theory out of, and you gave examples where it does, versus it being a mechanism that was then what you used to think about your psychological theory, right? So in other words,
that's not what you. That was not the claim.
I said neurons go from being a source of evidence, send out all your hounds, to being the mechanistic explanation.
You did not. You used, John. You use the word confirmation, not the word evidence. They're very different from each other.
I'm saying that when you come up with a theory, I mean, it's very important, right? If you have, I'm open to there being a clue, whether it's somebody having a Freudian slip or there being a grid cell. These things can both be used.
Or they're discovering there's different. Or there's discovering there's different circuits for enacting behaviors from preventing behaviors.
Well, I don't think that's what go-no. I don't think that's what go-no is about.
Let's simplify. I understand that there are different input, but like you genuinely makes you think about the behavior differently when you know the neurocircuitry.
Well, if you're going to say again, that a Freudian slip and a neural aha moment like a Freudian slip, and you use a behavioral weirdness and a neural weirdness, and they help you construct a theory, I'm all for that.
Yeah.
Okay. That's not it. What I'm saying is that I'm not convinced that a mechanistic explanation at the level of connections in the cells is going to be what you construct your psychological theory out of. It will be fed into it, but the actual psychological sentence or theory that you construct will be a higher order object. But that higher order object was definitely built out of moments of aha from neural data and from behavioral data. Okay, but it's not the same as saying...
I'm happy with that.
Do you see, then it's not exactly the same as a circuit mechanism, in my view.
Yeah, I think you're saying that it's going to be a mishmash now, and then we're going to try and find the explanation wherever we can. And I sort of like that muddiness somehow. I think that I misinterpreted what you said earlier. Then I thought earlier you were arguing that neuroscience had never offered anything apart from confirmation to our theories of how the mind works.
That is true, John. That's
what I said is that when you finally come up with a psychological theory that you used neural evidence for, right? When you come up with two, let's say that you were so inspired by, Gabor filters or grid cells, and you came up with two alternative theories about navigation or thinking. And then you went back to the neural data and said, well, given my two theories, I expect to see this. That will be confirmatory, even though the initial trigger took you up to the psychological level. But once you construct your high level theory, you're going to circle back for confirmation. But the actual theorizing was done at the psychological task level. So it's like a 1-2-1 step thing.
Yeah, someone else should speak. Jonathan, you should tell us what the answer is.
Wait, so I just want to clarify something. So John, last session, you were saying representations should be only ascribed to system 2 prefrontal representations with semantic content. And this Hopfieldian view is not at all that. You can have representations for V1. It doesn't need to be higher level. It doesn't need to be system 2, and it doesn't need to be semantic. And a related thing that Rosa was saying is that you should say, which is one of the questions she left in the chat before she left, which was that you say we should adopt a more demanding notion of representation, one that requires detachability, misrepresentation, truth conditions, etc. And you say that a distinctive feature of the Hopfieldian approach is that it uses representational spaces. Do the state space characterizations of neural activity that would be employed by what you call Hopfieldian approach satisfy these demanding conditions? And she just based that question on what was said today. But last time you also mentioned that we should just call things that are system 2 representation. We should discuss about it for a bit animatedly. So
yeah, no, that's absolutely fair. Yes.
Okay. So do you see that Hopfieldian representations are not necessarily system 2? I mean, they have no condition.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I think I said before that I do think the useful notion of representation ends up mapping quite well onto system 2 concepts. I don't think absolutely right that there are lots and lots of Hopfieldian phenomena that are not representational in that sense. But I think the argument we're trying to make. No,
they're representational, but not system 2.
No. I think it's absolutely true that if I had my way, to be absolutely fair, Ida, I would actually reserve the term representation in Hopfieldian spaces for when I think it's the kind that should have those system 2 cognitive representations. No, absolutely. And as I said, it's just a best bet that if we're going to get any insight into non-arbitrary Gracian semantic representations, that we're more likely to get a clue of the kind that Tim is talking about from a kind of derived population type analysis. I don't think we're going to get it by looking at a neuron doing something odd. That would be my guess.
So let's come back to the question that I was asking. So the Hopfieldian view, which is the way forward based on your suggestion, has a notion of representation that's not system 2.
No, no, I don't think that. What I'm saying
you
is,
think sorry, just to be clear, so are you claiming that every notion of representation in the Hopfieldian view is a system 2 representation?
no, I'm saying that if I had my way, I would reserve for cognition the word representation. And I'm saying that type of representation, that it's got intentionality, it's detachable, and it's flexible, and all those features, that's what I would reserve the word representation for. And if we're ever going to get insight into that kind of representation that leads to thinking, I think we're going to need to take a Hopfieldian approach. To the degree that people who take Hopfieldian approaches like Mark Churchland in M1 and will use the word representation or not, I think it shouldn't be, I don't think it should be used.
So you think the word representation shouldn't be used for V1?
No.
Okay, it shouldn't be used probably for FFA or PPA.
I'm not sure what those are doing in terms of computation over representations, but you're absolutely right that I take very much the Bill Ramsey view, just for everyone to know that when
Let's
things
not name so many people.
No, just to say that when something is just a disposition or a relay switch, which is used a lot in neuroscience for representation, like, the hand area and motor cortex is represented, or leg position is represented in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, I actually don't think the word representation should be used there.
So let me ask my question again. Regardless of everything else, just this particular question. So are faces represented in FFA and are scenes represented in PPA?
Not if they're not, I wouldn't use that word if they're not detached.
Is space represented in the state spaces, are they represented in the hippocampus?
Yeah, that's a much better one. I would say that I think the hippocampus is the battleground for a rich notion of representation that would meet my criteria. So for example, if it was really true that vicarious trial and error and replay really was a simulation of that maze in the head of the rat, and it chose its decision, made its decision based on a genuine simulation of the geography, yes, I would call that a representation.
Only if if it's only triggered when the animal's right there in VTE.
Well, I mean, I think, when you talk, I've gotten myself, talking to David Foster about this, pre-play, replay, and, obviously the work Ida's done. But I would say that if you can conjure up something in your mouse head about, and it's quite rich, it's quite abstract, it's not just an internal state, it's actually something you can use and play with, which it sounds like it's getting very close to the notion of representation that I'm arguing for. Yes, I think the hippocampus and replay is getting close to that notion. Yes. Yes.
What is system 1, system 2 for those of us who?
It's just it's Kahneman's notion of sort of automatized reflex versus deliberative, slow, model-based, meaning-based, and I would say that the battleground is in the hippocampus, and I think that it is very close to being the representation I'm arguing for. Yes, Ida.
Tim is at 9% battery, both ontologically and epistemologically. I want to hear Jonathan, but John, I think that you might be the only person on earth who thinks that representation should be reserved for hippocampus and above. And I think that neuroscience has been using the word in ways that we understand, and it's consistent with the way, computer science, deep learning, etc. uses, and there's a nice correspondence. I'm always confused. What do philosophers or philosophy-inclined people want when they want to change the notion of the tools of the trade of another field? I never have a good answer to that, but I appreciate that you are clarifying. So in a matter of speaking, your notion of representation is post-Hopfieldian, because it's not sufficient that it should be Hopfieldian, it should also be system 2. It seems like it's not, so Hopfield is not enough for you.
Not enough. No. It's just that if we're going to get to that rich notion of representation, which we think is at the heart of cognition, the best through way to it is probably a Hopfieldian derived object.
So yeah, as Tim is saying, replay exists in primary visual cortex and etc. So honestly, I think that even with some of the criteria you said, that's not consistent what you're saying. I agree with Tim, but that's okay.
Well, I don't care whether it's hippocampus or visual cortex. It's whether it's replay of a flexible model that I care about. I mean, I'm actually agnostic as to location. If it turns out that you hadn't run a simulation of a corridor in V1, then so be it, right? I mean, that's fine.
Honestly, I think if I'm seeing something and it's represented in my V1, it's represented in my V1.
I just don't think that's
useful.
useful.
Patch. Well, you're the only one who thinks
I'm not the only one,
right?
actually. I'm not the only one. There are a lot of people who've written about this, Ida. It's not only me. I think that there's...
John, forget philosophers. Which neuroscientists?
I don't care what neuroscientists are hopelessly confused.
Okay. That's interesting.
I really do think, I mean, I'm being very genuine. I think neuroscientists, in the way they use representation, it's not just a semantic argument. I think it's actually led to the wrong approach. I would actually say that the Sharingtonian approach to cognition has played out for too long because of a misunderstanding of the word representation, with the idea that taking the notion that has come from V1 or S1, wrongly transplanted, and the tuning idea has actually set the field back. That's it. So I actually think that the word representation has been problematic for the study of cognition.
So you haven't shown why it's been problematic, so I'm just going to put it aside as, you know, you've hung out with philosophers and you think what they say is somehow superior to neuroscientists.
Well, thank you. I'm glad that Rose is saying he's not the only one who thinks that.
She's a philosopher, and she also said, I'm a philosopher, so maybe that's why I think
that.
Well,
philosophers are very good at clarifying.
John, I see that you're animated, but here's what I'm going to say, and I've said this before. Philosophers have been confused about representation for 50 years now. I've read it. I've seen those fights.
And neuroscientists are more.
Well, I'm not sure. Like, you know, we know what the visual representation is or hippocampal representation is, and we don't get confused. But just for the purpose of this conversation today, one more thing I just wanted to reiterate. So you think the Hopfieldian view is not enough? Oh, no. I'm sorry. Okay.
My computer's dead.
Right. Okay.
Thanks, Tim.
See you, Tim. So, John, you think Hopfieldian view is not enough, basically. So all of the issue of Sharingtonian versus Hopfieldian is not enough.
No. Not
at the end of the day. Okay.
No. And what did Rosa
Jonathan,
say?
I think.
But I went into philosophy from neuroscience because I thought that.
But still, it doesn't count because you need to be practice. I want the name of a practicing neuroscientist.
You always say this, but this argument of yours never convinces me. Practicing neuroscientists is those they somehow
calm down.
But they don't have
deep breath.
They don't have some.
Somebody mute John.
They just don't have some.
Me.
I didn't. I'm just saying they don't have some kind of card-carrying right to the ultimate truth because they're practicing neuroscience.
That's not the claim. Please don't exaggerate. Please don't dramatize things, John. It's a very simple thing. You haven't shown us how they're using the term representation has been harmful for some scientific finding. Until you show that, the burden of proof is on you. And, you know, I don't know what the evidence is. People can agree or disagree. Usually, statistically, if there is a sort of agreement or disagreement, the determining factor is whether there are arguments that can. On your session, on Rosa's session, we're going to discuss Rosa's example because Rosa says she has examples. But I remember we've had this discussion before, and I think I disagree with many philosophers, including Rosa. But with that, I really want to hear Jonathan before we go into like the closing, because it's already 7:07, and it's honestly been like, yeah, go on, Jonathan.
Oh, my brief comment was that the conversation earlier seemed to be the difference between an explanation and the explanatory tool that gets you there. But regarding representation, I don't think you're ever going to get a consensus among philosophers about what representation means broadly. Like as a pragmatist, I think the distinction is only meaningful insofar as it aids the kinds of inquiries you're aiming at, right? And so the meaning of the term within the structures of inquiry that you're deploying is valuable, right? But when you're trying to export it into another context, you need to think about the whole web of meaning that may or may not come with the word representation. And so given that there's extreme conflict between philosophers and neuroscientists, and I honestly have no stake in this fight, given the extremity there, right? It may be that the word itself stands in the way of any collaborative inquiry, because we will fight, or disciplines will fight to the death to preserve a given meaning within their context. But that's a whole other that actually is not a whole other point. It correlates with the question of the explanation versus the tool we're using to get there, right? And so at least what I'm gathering from this interdisciplinary conversation is that representation is not an effective tool to get us to a kind of collaborative exercise between philosophy and philosophy and so on and so forth. So I would say all of this is to say that the projects that we're engaging in structure the ways that we use language. And to answer your question, Ida, why philosophers try to constantly redefine stuff is to make it do specific kinds of work within a given project. And I'm not a real big fan of constantly redefining a term, find a new one, right? Because representation in aesthetics definitely does not mean what we're talking about representation means here, but it's still a valuable term when we're talking about aesthetic experience. And to bring it back, I don't think the framework we've been talking about here can do anything with aesthetic experience, right? Which was a question I was going to pose to John here. Given your project in the paper, how can you talk through something like art? Because it does use what you might call representations, right? When we're reading a book, we have images in our minds, and there's research that's been done on this, of the scenes that are going on, regardless of our embodied experience of those scenes. So how then could your structure account for this? This is the thing that I've been saying.
It can't. I would say that art is an incredible, wonderful example of this very rich form of representation that we're trying to get at. As Ida said, this paper can't even begin to get to that rich notion of representation, other than and David can speak to this, the intuition that if we are going to have a naturalized theory of unnatural semantic content using neuroscience data, that it's more likely to come in the form of Hopfieldianly derived objects. And so to your question, I don't think we're going to have a grid cell or a mirror neuron moment when it comes to explaining the neural basis of art, right? We're going to probably have to come up with something more elaborate that is more likely to be Hopfieldian. But that's just a bet, and David can say it. It's just a bet that if we're going to naturalize why we like art, we're more likely to do Hopfieldian neuroscience. I don't know what you think, David. I don't think we're going to have a neural tuning theory of it, is my guess.
So before we go into a long discussion about art, for those who are leaving and everyone, I just want to thank Claire and Bahar, who are behind the scenes. Thank you so much for being with us. I want to acknowledge what Jovo said, that evidence in favor of claims is the most useful, not who's saying it. And I agree with Jovo. And what I have in mind with, is there a neuroscientist who says this? I want to see whether there is evidence that it has actual usefulness to get rid of this word for whatever reason in neuroscience. And that's what I haven't seen the evidence of. So I thank Jovo for that clarification in the chat. With that, before David goes into his outro, which would potentially concern art, I just want to say I read this book that I really thought that was interesting. It's called What Tech Calls Thinking. So I don't know if we can get to have the author here, but this is a person who's a professor of comparative literature at Stanford and looks at how tech companies explain how they're growing AI and what actually is what's happening. So I think it's very related to the discussions we've had various times here, but what they say, their thinking processes, and what they might be actually thinking. So if you have the time, it's a very small book. You can read it in a short time. With that, please go ahead, David. We will have an outro about Hopfieldian views and art.
I was just going to comment on some of the stuff that John had said. I don't have any like prepared outro. I didn't know if that was okay or not. But yeah, I mean, I think that the best work in all of philosophy on representation is Nelson Goodman's Languages of Art, where he explicitly addresses, it's tremendously overlooked. I know we hate talking, I mean, we're not supposed to mention names. So what he does is he provides us like, oh my God, this complete framework for classifying representational systems that's more comprehensive than anything else I've ever read. And it's specifically focused on art, on dance, on music, on painting. And it is a level of depth that goes far beyond most of philosophy, and certainly any discussion of the notion of representation in neuroscience. I don't think it shakes out left or right, Sharingtonian or Hopfieldian, although I think there's a lot of skepticism now about whether there's any distinction between these views. So I'm not even sure if that's a useful conceptual contribution. But having said that, we do make a bet in the paper that insofar as Hopfieldian versus Sharingtonian contrast is a useful cognitive construct, conceptual distinction, that it is going to be a Hopfieldian type of explanation that's going to be able to handle those kinds of experiences or cognitions.
And I just want to
John,
say,
famous last words. Oh yeah, go on.
I'm just so grateful for all the guests that came to speak today. There's so many amazing people, women, just lots of great ideas shared. I'm just really excited that they can do it here.
Yeah, thanks for inviting them, Jovo. That was very
and David,
lovely to have all of them.
Thank you, David, for having stray bullets aimed at me hit you sometimes. But I do think that what I think is really valuable about this is not about where the bones of contention are, but what I definitely think, whoever survived in the chat, is that it is going to get people thinking again about these issues. But even if the word representation is allowed to stay in neuroscience in its diluted form, it will make people take another think about it and go, well, when do I use it? When shouldn't I use it? So that's what I think this salon does the best, is it like arguments that one has with one's friends, it's the replay later where you go, oh, I kind of see what they meant too, kind of thing. And I think that's what this salon is like. It's not just what happens during it, but what happens offline. And I think that's really valuable by having such high quality guests.
Thank you, John. I agree that the high quality guests are very interesting in terms of the discussion. I just want to acknowledge what Jess says in the chat, with which I agree. She says, I find I am increasingly skeptical of stances that seek to discredit large swaths of existing work and approaches, or worse, large swaths of researchers as naive or confused. You're all probably very wrong, and I try to keep that in mind. And I think that that's very correct. I hope that that's not how I came across when I kept asking, is there a neuroscientist who's doing that? The reason I was asking that was I was looking for evidence. But I agree, calling entire practices of neuroscience using the word representation for 50 years confused without evidence, I think that that's really
just to clarify that though, the work can be separated from the terms used to describe it. In fact, the work and a lot of it, so it's not, the work isn't being dismissed at all. The work is just stands on its own and is great and doesn't require the black feather, just like Dumbo didn't need the black feather to fly. I'm saying it's a black feather. It doesn't actually do any more work on top of what the great science has already done. Let's be very clear. Let's not say that we're dismissing all the work that has the word representation in it. I'm just saying that it doesn't do much extra work in its dilute form. So I'm not dismissing anything in terms of work. I mean, that's very important.
Nidhi says that we can also have actual replay as it is also recorded, and I agree.
Well, right. It's not quite the same as showing that it's causally being used.
No, she's talking about these videos.
But I'm going to go, actually, because I'm going to get into real trouble. if I stay any longer. David.
Wait, here or there? Where are you going?
Right here. Thanks, Jonathan, Ida, David, Joe, obviously.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me on. I'm very grateful
Thank
for that
you.
opportunity.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.